Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to hear evidence from Dany Cotton, formerly the London Fire Commissioner. So,
yes,
Mr. Millett.
Mr. Chairman, good morning. Morning, members of the panel. I now call Ms. Dany Cotton, please.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Ms. Cotton.
Good morning.
I understand you're going to take the oath.
Please.
So the testament should be there. Would you take it in your right hand and read the words on the screen, please?
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Now, do sit down, make yourself comfortable there.
Thank you.
All right?
Yes, thank you.
Good, thank you. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Ms. Cotton, good morning.
Good morning.
And can I start by thanking you very much for coming back to the inquiry and assisting us with our Phase 2 investigations. We're extremely grateful to you. My questions are intended to be short and simple. Sometimes they don't work out that way, so I'm very happy to repeat the question or put the point or question in a different way. Can I ask you also, please, to keep your voice up so that the transcriber who sits to your right can take down everything you're saying? It's very important that we capture every word accurately on the transcript.
Yes.
Can I also ask you not to nod or shake your head, but to say yes or no, as the case may be, because otherwise a nod or a gesture doesn't come out on the transcript.
Of course.
If you need a break at any time, other than the scheduled breaks that we'll take, then please just let us know and we can take a break. Now, you've given 3 Rule 9 witnesses to the inquiry for this phase. Let me show you those. The first was dated the 14th of February 2019. That is at LFB 000-32737, please. Is that your first statement displayed there on your screen?
It is.
Can you please go to page 10? Is that your signature above the date?
It is.
Now, just to be clear, that was, of course, wasn't it, before the publication of the Phase 1 report in October 2019?
Yes, it was.
Yes. Now, the second statement is dated the 27th of May 2020, LFB 00118213, please. Is that your second statement to the inquiry for Phase 2 on the screen?
It is.
Can you please go to page 13? Is that your signature in there in the block above the date?
It is.
You also have a third statement of the 7th of September 2020, LFB 00118915. Can you please be shown that? Is that your third statement displayed there on the screen?
It is.
Thank you. And if we go please to page 6, is that your signature above the date?
It is.
Thank you very much. Now, you've, I think, also given a witness statement to the Metropolitan Police on the 21st of February 2018, focusing primarily on the events of the night of the 14th of June 2017. I will not be asking you about that statement, but for reference purposes, so that we have it, it's at MET 00012492. The 3 statements that I've shown you this morning, can you please confirm that you've read them recently?
I have, yes.
And can you confirm that their contents are true?
They are, yes.
Are you happy for those statements to be taken as your evidence to the inquiry?
Yes, I am.
Now, your statements have a number of documents exhibited to them. Can you confirm that you have reviewed those documents recently?
Yes, I have.
And have you discussed your evidence with anybody before coming here today?
Only with my legal counsel.
Right. Now, I'd like to begin with some questions about your roles and responsibilities within the LFB during the time covered by this part of the inquiry. If we go back to your first witness statement, please, LFB 00032737, page 2, paragraph 5, you tell us there that you joined the LFB as an operational firefighter in 1988, yes?
That's correct.
Yes. And you go on in that paragraph to say that you were made a Deputy Assistant Commissioner within Central Operations as of 1st of October 2007, yes?
Yes.
Yes. Did you hold any other senior officer roles before you were appointed as a DAC?
No, that was the first senior officer role I held.
You didn't, right. What was the remit of the Central Operations Department in which you were a DAC?
So Central Operations was within the Operations Department, and I was reporting to Assistant Commissioner Dave Brown. the role of central operations was to coordinate a number of the functions that took place for fire stations. So, for instance, we would be a conduit for the 4 area Deputy Assistant Commissioners to feed information into the Assistant Commissioner. We would be responsible sometimes for ensuring that messages and information were disseminated. I was responsible also for another team that worked to me who main role was to ensure that sufficient firefighters and officers were available on a daily basis to be at fire stations and therefore to ensure sufficient crewing levels. So they managed the leave, they managed the sickness for the sort of whole of the operations for the London Fire Brigade.
Right. And is it right that department became known as the Operations Prevention and Response Department?
Not that specific role. Central Operations remained as Central Operations, so that's the whole directorate is the OP&R, so that was a much wider reaching directorate.
I follow. And what was your role yourself within the Central Operations Department between October 2007 and February or March 2012?
So I was the Deputy Assistant Commissioner in charge. I had 4 group managers and some station managers working directly to me at headquarters. I had another team of 2 group managers working out of Stratford, and that was the team that managed the leave and basically the allocation of people to fire stations. So I was directly day-to-day managing those. And I also reported to Assistant Commissioner Dave Brown, and for a while we also had other Assistant Commissioners when I think he explained the areas were split north and south. So we had an Assistant Commissioner called Andy Barrett and then one called Andy Hickmott, and I reported into him as well.
Yes, I see. So you were, just to be clear, during those years you reported to AC Dave Brown and AC Andy Hickmott.
Yes, and his predecessor, Andy Barrett.
And
as
before
well.
him, Andy Barrett. Did
Yes.
you report to anybody else during those years?
No, not during that time.
Now, you go on in paragraph 5 of your statement on the screen in front of you to say that you became Assistant Commissioner for Operational Assurance, or ACOA, on the 1st of March 2012. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Could you please give the panel a brief overview of the remit of the Operational Assurance Department?
Yes, of course. So Operational Assurance was a new department that was established in 2012. It was a result of the Commissioner and the Corporate Management Board wanting a greater oversight into various aspects of mainly firefighter safety. So it was amalgamating the Health and Safety Department with a very small team of incident management. The view was that it was a way of being able to oversee the whole process of the operations on the fire ground. So from the start point of crews attending the fire ground, the actions that took place there, but then also collating those with accident information. So the Health and Safety Department were responsible for collating all accidents and near misses, whether that was personnel accidents, vehicle accidents, or near miss accidents. And those would literally go from, broken pieces of equipment to more serious injuries to firefighters. And I think there was a view by the Commissioner at that time, Ron Dobson, that we needed a more thorough way of being able to ensure that all those processes were identified so that we could identify if there was a risk, for instance, to firefighters in the future from repeat accidents happening.
Was there a trigger, to the best of your recollection, for the creation of the Operational Assurance Department in 2012?
I don't think anything specific. I think that there had been a number of issues with the then management of the Health and Safety Department that I think the Commissioner wanted to have an operational officer as the overarching officer in charge, but working alongside a health and safety professional. But I think there had been a number of operational incidents where firefighters had been either quite seriously injured or had the potential to be seriously injured. And I think that the concern was that we weren't doing enough to identify those trends and to try and give information to the workforce to prevent them happening again.
Yes, I see. Now, if we go to page 5 of your statement, please, your first statement, look at paragraph 18. if you look at the third line down, you say this: as AC/OA, my role included the provision of strategic advice and support to resolve operational incidents, planning, implementing and leading organisational strategy, evaluating performance and developing staff. The AC/OA was a new role created to provide combined leadership to the incident management team and the health and safety team dealing with firefighter safety and welfare. This was done in order to streamline the process of investigating any health and safety failures occurring during LFB operational work and to learn and identify any trends. Now, you say there that the Assistant Commissioner OA was a new role. Was it created when you took up the post in March 2012?
Yes, it was.
Right, so you were the first occupant of that post.
I was.
And it sounds from what you've told us that the Operational Assurance Department was an entirely new department, but bringing together a number of different pre-existing functions.
Yes, that's right.
Yes. But, would it be fair to summarise your role as primarily being concerned with effective incident command, safe operations and management of risks on the fireground?
Yes, that's correct.
And you say your role was created, as you say, to provide combined leadership to the incident management team and the health and safety team in order to streamline the process of investigating any health and safety failures. Why was that combined leadership and streamline process required?
I think that it was felt that the incident management team were very sort of function on their own. They were quite a small team. They were responsible for the oversight of the operational review team who went to the fireground, who were effectively the quality assurance team for the fireground. But I think that it was felt that there wasn't potentially a strong enough link between them and then the accident investigation that the health and safety team undertook. So I think the Commissioner and the Corporate Management Board wanted to tie those two functions together.
I see. And the reference to health and safety, is that a reference both to firefighters and to members of the public, or just the firefighters?
So the Health and Safety Department were responsible for the overall health and safety of everyone working for London Fire Brigade. That was their primary function. So not just the operational staff, but all of the staff in all of the offices, control and everywhere else.
But when you refer there to investigating any health and safety failures, are you referring to health and safety failures vis-à-vis staff only, or do you include members of the public?
So these were health and safety failures primarily relating to operational firefighters, but then if it was an operational incident that resulted in some form of investigation, there might naturally be an element of that talked about members of the public, but it wasn't that we never were specifically tasked with looking at operational failures in relation to the members of the public.
Yes. Now, is it right that the Incident Management Policy Group also sat within the Operational Assurance Department?
That's the Incident Management Team. That was a team of 5 people, so 1 Deputy Assistant Commissioner, 2 group managers, station manager and an administrative assistant.
And you were the DAC?
No, I was the Assistant Commissioner. The DAC was Graham Ellis.
Right. The DAC was Graham Ellis?
Yes.
And I think he later became AC?
He did. When I became promoted, he then became AC and took on the role of that department.
Yes. And is it right that incident management is another term for incident command?
Yes, it is. It's the joining of the two things. So it's command and management, I find, sometimes are used as an interchangeable term.
And you tell us that the Incident Management Policy Group is the incident management team. Just to be clear, what was the function of that policy group as a policy group?
So it was primarily, their function was the coordination of the information received from operational incidents. So I think you've been familiar with the database that was used for operational staff following operational incidents, whether it was identification of learning points for individuals or teams, or to do with organisational issues. And the operational review team who went out to significant incidents. So it was the management of those functions, the collation of that information, and then how that was used to feed into things like operational news and to give information to the ODCB.
Yes, I see. And your database reference, is that the IMPD?
It is, yes.
Yes, I see. Now, as I say, therefore, as Assistant Commissioner for Operational Assurance, you would have had, is this right, ultimate responsibility for the LFB's incident command policy?
Yes, that's right.
Yes. And I think you remained in the role of AC for Operational Assurance until the 1st of December 2015, when you were appointed to Director of Safety and Assurance with effect from the 1st of January 2016.
That's correct.
Yeah. And that position, is this right, was formerly known as Director of Operations Resilience and Training, or DOORT?
Yes, that's correct.
And we heard, I think, in Module 5 that your immediate predecessor in that role was AC James Dalgleish from January 2015, and before him, AC Gary Reason. Is that correct?
So Gary Reason was an AC. James Dalgleish was not an assistant commissioner. He was a senior non-uniformed manager in the organisation.
I see. Well, did he have you say a senior non-uniformed, did he have a tag, a role, a title?
So he was previously the head of HR and organisational learning, I think it was, and then he stepped in when Gary Reason retired and did that role for a year as the head of that department, or the head of that whole section. So, but he wasn't. So assistant commissioners are obviously all operational and uniformed. The staff who are not uniformed all have different titles depending on what directorate or what team they manage.
Are you able to help us with why the Directorate changed its name from Operations, Resilience and Training to Safety and Assurance?
I'm not sure of the exact reason behind it. Again, it was the decision of the Commissioner and the Corporate Management Board before I joined them to change that name of that team before I took over. So once again, it was something that was established that I came into in my new role.
I follow. Now, in your position as newly appointed Director of ORT, is it right that you would have been responsible for a number of departments? Let me list them and say yes or no as we go through them. First, development and training.
Yes, that's correct.
Yes. Operational policy, formerly known as operational procedures.
That's correct.
Operational resilience.
Yes.
Operational assurance.
Yes.
Operational review team, the ORT.
Yes.
And health and safety.
That's yes.
Is there anything I've missed?
No, I don't think so.
Thank you. How often do those departments and their relevant heads of service report to you?
So we would have one-to-one meetings on a monthly basis with all of the different heads, but then we would also have a monthly management board meeting where the heads of those individual departments would all attend or send a deputy if they couldn't attend. But on a more regular basis, I would speak to them all on probably a weekly basis for general catch-ups. And
which of those types of meetings that you've just described for us were formally minuted?
So the management board meetings were formally minuted, the departmental management board, so the DMBs.
But not your one-to-one meetings, which you have monthly with the heads of service?
No, they weren't minuted.
To what extent did you have oversight of the work that your heads of service were undertaking?
So I had oversight, so we would talk about the key functions of the department, we would talk about any problems they were experiencing, any issues they had, or if there were any areas of underperformance flagged for any reason through either corporate reporting or through something that had gone wrong, then we would have conversations and explore those issues.
Did you monitor their work in any specific way?
By the regular meetings we had, but also for any of the performance indicators they were responsible for, and then for outputs in relation to whatever their department was specifically working on at that time.
Right. And you refer to performance indicators. Did each of those 6 departments that we've discussed together have formal performance indicators?
So they wouldn't necessarily have formal ones that reported as part of the corporate digest. Those were very specific, but they would all have departmental performance indicators that they would work to.
You refer to the corporate digest. What is that?
So that was London Fire Brigade's corporate strategy, where they would decide which key performance indicators they were going to be assessed against, that they would report to the Assembly on the regular Assembly meetings that the Commissioner would be responsible for. So I think you heard Dave Brown talking about ones in relation to control and call handling times. It was those kind of high-level functions.
Right. Now, you also go on in paragraph 5 of your witness statement, if we can go back to page 2, please, in the last 3 lines of that paragraph, that you were appointed interim London Fire Commissioner on the 1st of January 2017, and you say, I was appointed to the substantive post of Commissioner on the 14th of June 2017. Why was your appointment initially on an interim basis only?
There were some legislation changes coming into the Fire and Rescue Service nationally, where there were a number of different governance arrangements taking place. So some fire and rescue services were working to a mayoral function, some were working under police and crime commissioners, and as part of that legislation change, the role of the London Fire Brigade Commissioner to become a corporation sole effectively was going to take place. Unfortunately, the legislation took a little longer than was anticipated. So I was initially appointed as an interim while they were waiting for legislation, which then took a while. So a decision was made in May that they were going to hold an appointments committee in June and put me into the post substantively.
Right, I see. So the role of interim was not as it were, a trial run. It was for constitutional reasons.
It was, yes.
I see. Now, we understand from a witness statement provided by former Commissioner Ron Dobson that he gave you a handover between September 2016 and December 2016. Do you recall that?
Yes, it wasn't as clear a handover as I think anyone would have liked under the circumstances, because it was such an enormous role. But I was obviously more familiar with the day-to-day internal London Fire Brigade business, but there was such a wide-ranging remit for the Commissioner of external-facing roles that those were the ones I felt I wasn't quite as familiar with.
And what did the handover consist of? Do you remember?
So it was just some meetings we had. I was invited to attend meetings that the Commissioner then went to internally mainly. I think I only went to one externally facing meeting as a deputy for him because he was unable to go. But it was a relatively low key. It wasn't minuted, they weren't documented, and it wasn't involving any kind of document handover or anything.
You didn't get a file of material and go through it with him?
No, I didn't.
Now, can I just ask you about one or two other positions of responsibility, touching on the Lakenal House Board and the Lakenal House Working Group? If you stick with this page of your statement and look at paragraph 6, please, you say that you were a member of the Operational Directorates Coordination Board, the ODCB, chaired by the Deputy Commissioner Rita Dexter. And you became a member of that in June 2012 after you were appointed to AC Operational Assurance in the March of that year. That's correct. Now, if you look at the last 3 lines of paragraph 6 of your statement, you say, I outline my involvement in the ODCB at the outset because it played a key role in LFB learning and development as a result of incidents that it and other fire services were involved in. Now, on the basis of what you've told us already, would it be fair to say that that was a key responsibility of the Operational Assurance Department?
The ODCB was very much a corporate management function, which was chaired by the Deputy Commissioner, and the other directors sat on it as well. So it was very much a corporate board that the ACOA was one key player involved in that, in regard with all the other assistant commissioners and heads of service that were relevant. So it was a very high-level board, and my role as ACOA was to feed in relation to operational incidents.
Yes, I mean, you use the expression key player for the role of the ACOA on that board. No,
sorry, that says that the ODCB was a key role, not that my role was key. It says outlined because it played a key role, that ODCB played the key role in operational learning and development.
Yes, it does. And what I was building on was what you said about the role of ACOA in respect of the ODCB as a corporate management entity. You said that you were effectively a key player, one of a number.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, I see. And you remained a member of the ODCB, the Operational Directorates Coordination Board, upon your promotion to Director of Safety and Assurance in December 2015.
Yes, that's right.
Yes. Did you remain a member until the ODCB's final meeting of September 2016, when it was replaced by the Operational Professionalism Board in December 2016?
Yes, I did.
Yes. Now, both Rita Dexter and Gary Reason mentioned something called the Commissioners' Group. They described that as an informal meeting of the Commissioner and his 3 directors. Sue Budden, I left out of the present discussion. Would you agree with that?
Yes, it is.
Would you have become a member of that group on your promotion to Director of Safety and Assurance in December 2015?
Yes, I did.
You did. We've also heard that a more formal but distinct group met regularly, and that group was called the Corporate Management Board, and you've already referred to it in your evidence, or the CMB. Were you a member of that group?
Yes, upon promotion, I became a member of that group.
So is this right, that as of and after December 2015, as Director of Safety and Assurance, you would have had extensive involvement in or oversight and knowledge of the LFB's organisational workings and priorities?
Yes, I did.
And you contributed to the LFB's key decisions and strategy?
Yes, I did.
Yes. Now, throughout your evidence, we're going to be touching on the work of the Lakenal House Board and the Lakenal House Working Group, straddling either side of the Lakenal House inquest in the first quarter of 2013. Can I begin with the Lakenal House Board? It's right, I think, isn't it, that that was an internal LFB board set up in July 2009 to investigate the fire at Lakenal House in that year?
Yes, it was.
And that was, is this right, to ensure that the lessons of Lakenal were learnt?
Yes.
Yes. Am I right in thinking, more generally, that the fire at Lakenal House, with its 6 fatalities, was regarded at the time by the LFB as a defining incident for the Brigade?
Yes, definitely.
And as an opportunity to identify with precision what it could learn and improve on? Yes? So just not if one can call a fatal incident run-of-the-mill, but if one can, not one of those.
No, I don't. I think it would be unfair to say that we treated any incident involving a fatality or loss of life as run-of-the-mill. I think that we used every one of those as an opportunity for learning, because no 2 operational incidents are the same, and therefore it's important that we identify and learn lessons from all of those. But obviously such a key incident with loss of 6 lives that resulted in the coroner making recommendations is a key piece of learning for London Fire Brigade.
But would you accept that even before the coroner made those recommendations, Lakenal was something of a milestone, a turning point?
Yes, definitely.
And that the desire to learn with precision the lessons from Lakenal were rooted in the event itself and not the coroner's recommendations?
Yes, and I believe that's the reason why the Commissioner and the Corporate Management Board set up this internal investigation very early doors to start identifying those lessons before even the coroner's recommendations took place.
Now, you say in your first witness statement at page 5, if we can go back to it, please, at paragraph 17, I was not involved with the board in my role as a DAC, save that the minutes of the board that I have reviewed indicated that I did attend a meeting on the 1st of October 2009. And then you go on to say, in the first line of paragraph 18, that you became a member of the board following your appointment to Assistant Commissioner in March 2012, and you attended the board's meetings as of 22nd of May 2012. Yes?
That's correct.
Yes. Is it right that the board was in existence from July 2009 right through until the 30th of September 2013, when it was effectively disbanded?
Yes.
Yes. Now, we've mentioned the separate Lakenal House Working Group. We've heard from earlier witnesses that that was a body established by the LFB's governing body, the London Fire and Emergency Planning Authority, or LFEPA, and consisted of LFEPA members. Is that right?
That's correct.
And we've also heard that that group was established in June 2013, following the conclusion of the Lakenal House inquest and the receipt by the Brigade at the end of March of the Coroner's Rule 43 recommendations. Can you confirm that?
Yes, that's correct.
And can you also confirm for us that that board's primary purpose, the Lakenal House Working Group's purpose, was to oversee the LFB's response to the Rule 43 recommendations?
Yes, it was.
And is it also right that although LFB officers did attend meetings to give presentations to the Lakenal House Working Group, you were not involved with it because it was ordinarily officers at director level and above who would attend LFEPA committees?
That's correct.
Now, you nonetheless would have known, wouldn't you, something at least of the work of the Lakenal House Working Group because of your membership of the ODCB after July 2013 or June 2013, yes?
Yes.
Yes. I mean, having joined it the previous year in 2012. And is it also right that you would have known something of the work of the Lakanal House Working Group through your working with Gary Reason, AC Gary Reason?
Yes, that's right.
Yes. And you helped him, I think, with some of his reports to the Lakanal House Working Group, yes?
Yes.
Yes. Let's then turn, against that general background, to the ODCB and its general functioning, processes and operational assurance input. And I want to start by asking you something about how the ODCB worked and your involvement in it as Assistant Commissioner for Operational Assurance, or ACOA, as I think we have seen it frequently abbreviated in the documents. We know from Rita Dexter quite a lot about the ODCB and the DIOT process. And in summary, as she explained it, that the function of the ODCB was to provide essentially a forum for the two operational directorates to coordinate their activity, and that one of the board's central functions was to identify risks to operational staff through the DIOT process and to train them out. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Yes. If we look at your witness statement at page 2, please, back to page 2, paragraph 7, you say this: one of the key roles of the ODCB was to consider learning points, good and bad, or deficiencies flagged up within the performance review of operations and performance review of command processes, which take place following incidents involving 6 pumps or more and other incidents of note. Rule 43 recommendations issued by coroners to fire services across the country, as well as to the LFB, were also discussed at the ODCB, and decisions were taken on training or awareness raising across the LFB that may have been required. A significant aspect of my role as ACOA was to gather that information for ODCB to consider and take decisions on at each meeting. Now, just focusing on that last sentence there, we know that Rita Dexter told us how the IMP, or the Incident Monitoring Process Database, IMPD, and the Incident Monitoring 6 monthly reports were very central to ODCB's work in respect of operational performance. Do you agree with that basic description?
Yes, definitely.
Having shown you that, let's look at paragraph 10 on page 3 of your first witness statement here. And you say in the third line, observations, can you see it says, observations on IMPD are analysed on a quarterly basis and incorporated into a report to the ODCB. Now, is that the incident monitoring report?
Yes, it is.
And that, is it right, then became 6 monthly rather than quarterly?
I think it was reported 6 monthly at ODCB. There was a change, but I do believe, to my recollection, that I was concerned that we would potentially lose the opportunity to identify matters that might be occurring in that 6 month period. So it was then agreed that the information said there that the full list of IMPD matters would be shared with the Deputy Commissioner. I think it was outside of the meeting, so that there was a sort of a check on what was going on, because I think my concern was that 6 monthly was quite a long gap, and that things could occur in a 6 month period that you wouldn't wish to not start addressing because there hadn't been information shared with the meeting. Right.
We've got a picture from Rita Dexter's evidence that it was in 2013 when it went down from quarterly to 6 monthly, but then went back up again more frequently to something like 3 times a year or something like that. Can you help us?
I can't recall the reason why it changed. I do recall my concern about not having the information. I think there was a view by some people that quarterly wasn't sufficient to give you a real taste of what was going on, that it was such a short period of time you might not see trends that you could readily identify. My concern was that, you know, 1 or 2 occasions of something occurring might be enough of a trend for me to want to flag it, to prevent it happening again. So I think there was a kind of toing and froing of opinion about whether or not it was a substantive period of time to identify trends in.
Right. Do you remember a time when it became more frequently than 6 months?
I'm sure it went back to quarterly because the ODCB meetings were more frequently than 6 months. So I think that even if we had not shared the formal report, then I would have the opportunity to raise any concerns I had about trends in information.
And do you remember when it went back to quarterly?
No, I'm sorry, I don't recall.
Let's look at an example, LFB 30677840, please. This is an incident monitoring 6-monthly report. This one is for September 2014, and the meeting is the Operational Directorates Coordination Board, or ODCB. It's a report by DAC Graham Ellis of Operational Assurance, and it's agenda item number 2 for that meeting. I think DAC Ellis reported directly to you, as you told us.
He did.
At that time. Now, is it also right that DAC Graham Ellis was head of the Incident Management Policy Group? I think you said that before
Yes, he
this
was.
morning. Were you involved in any way in the drafting of these 6-monthly reports?
No, not the drafting. I would be shown effectively a final draft before it was submitted, but it was the responsibility of Graham Ellis and his team, along with Dr. Adrian Bevan from the Health and Safety Department, to collate this information.
Now, you've said in your statement, paragraph 7, which we've seen, that a significant aspect of your role as ACOA was to gather the information for the ODCB to consider and then take decisions on. If that's the case, what can you just tell us how that fed into your role in the production of this report?
Yes, so I had...
Or reports like it.
Sorry, I had both DAC Graham Ellis and Dr. Adrian Bevan, both highly qualified members of my team who worked for me, who were the ones who were responsible for the day-to-day administration of the two teams, and they would collate this information. But this wouldn't be, nothing in here would be a surprise to me, because we would have regular meetings, and where there were concerns about incidents either coming up as a result of a safety event or an occurrence on the fire ground, then I would be made aware of it at the time. So this was the more formal reporting process that then allowed us to share that information with ODCB.
Can we assume that you read or habitually read reports like this before they were submitted to the ODCB?
Yes.
Yes. Now, looking at the summary section, it says this report for the September 2014 Operational Directorates Coordination Board, the ODCB, outlines operational performance trends, individual, team and organisational, for the reporting periods of Q4 2013 to 14 and Q1 2014 to 15, and then in brackets 1st of January 2014 to 30th of June 2014. So just on that, it looks like the reporting year runs March to March, is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Yes, I see. So this is a 6-monthly report identifying trends from 2 contiguous quarters, 2 sequential quarters.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. And it sets out the source, but just below that, of the trends identified, utilising data and information from the following sources, and then there is a list of bullet points there, and you can see those. Are those all the DIOT sources?
No, these are a far wider range of sources. These could have come in from, especially things like the accident investigations and the safety event database, which Health and Safety maintained. These were, although they contained some of the aspects of the DIOT, this was a much wider ranging group of information that could be used to actually form this information. And also in there could be information, if anything came in from external sources, so national fire service issues, as it were.
Right. They're not all DIOT sources, as you've explained. No. Some of them are they not, though?
Yes, some of them are.
So the first one?
Yes.
Yes, and also the second one, I think.
Yes.
Rita Dexter told us that it was your department's responsibility at that time to consider these sources of information and distill what you considered to be relevant into this 6-monthly report. First, is she right about that?
Yes.
Yeah, and secondly, does that mean that you had almost complete control, or at least complete oversight, over what issues went to the ODCB for consideration so far as incident monitoring was concerned?
Yes, but in line with that, we also, at our regular sort of departmental meetings with Gary Reason at the time, would discuss any of those issues, because the relevant other heads from operational procedures and training would be in that department. So it would be, although the work would come through my department, it would be a result of more informed conversations with colleagues as well.
I see. Now look at page 2 of this report, please, if you can. We can see a list of proposed articles for the upcoming edition of Operational News, 28. Can you see that?
Yes, I can.
And it says the following list identifies subject areas which ODCB may wish to consider as the basis for articles in Operational News 28. The subject areas have been identified following the guidance agreed in the paper Identifying and Prioritising Operational News Features, agreed by ODCB in December 2012. We'll come on back to this in a moment, but we heard from Rita Dexter that the Operational News newsletter was the ODCB's primary output and its main way of updating firefighters and influencing their operational performance. That's what she told us on day 178. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Did your department draw this list of proposed articles from its analysis and interpretation of the DIOT sources and others?
Yes, in conjunction, I said, with other professional colleagues who would raise concerns with us and suggest areas that we might want to include. So it wasn't, it was something that was done very much as a sort of organisational overview with professional colleagues.
Right. Did those other colleagues include anybody in the fire safety department?
Yes, they would have done. So, for instance, fire investigation team worked directly to the fire safety department, and there obviously were standing members of ODCB, was the Assistant Commissioner for Fire Safety.
I see. What was your method, very basically, if you can identify it for us, of going about identifying proposed articles from the data you had?
So it would be a process of looking at the incident management reports and ascertaining whether there were any trends from people reporting either underperformance, failures of equipment or anything else. So it wouldn't necessarily have to be, large numbers of reporting on that, because 2 or 3 incidents I said might be leading to a trend that was growing. It would also be from other sources. So, for instance, the one there highlighted on the screen talks about fire investigation issue of removing samples from the fire ground. That would directly have fed into us from the fire investigation team. So it would be a wide range of looking across the piece of all the information and then coming up with a broad list that we considered would be relevant for conversations at ODCB, and not all of those items would be taken forward, because it would then be a conversation amongst colleagues at ODCB to choose the priorities.
Yes, but the feeding in from that came in part at least from you. Was it your responsibility, therefore, to identify areas of the LFB's performance on the fire ground that required improvement?
Yes, very much, through the operational review team and then through the incident management team.
Yes, and indeed one could say that was the very essence of your department.
Yes, along with, I wouldn't like to underestimate or underplay the significant role the health and safety team played in that as well, because that was the sort of the roll-on. So the incidents on the fire ground and identifying any potential areas of underperformance would then roll on into where issues had occurred and accidents had happened and firefighters had been injured, which would then be investigated by the health and safety team and would equally identify areas of underperformance that had potentially led to that event happening.
Certainly. Now, if we go to page 5 of this report, please, you will see a heading, IMPD Trend Analysis Reports, Quarter 4 and Quarter 1, January 14 to June 14. Introduction. The IMPD performance information in the following data sets and narratives continue to suggest a growing positive improvement in the use of the system. The number of entries have again risen, as has the quality and the number of positive comments. And then you can see the data set out graphically below that on the page. It's right, isn't it, that ultimately the IMPD's take-up was poor?
It wasn't as well used as we would have liked. Yes, that was an ongoing frustration we had.
Yes, and we can see that, in fact, can't we, from the grey pie chart below the introductory text, which says that out of 47,105 incidents attended by the LFB, 1 or more IMP reports were made in 1,679 cases, some 4% of the overall number of incidents attended. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
And would you agree that 4% of incidents is a very weak foundation on which to base decisions about the organisation's operational performance and training needs?
I think that it's also useful to reflect that for the vast majority of operational incidents attended by London Fire Brigade, there would be no need to generate an IMP report because they were only generated on large-scale incidents or something where there was a significant operational need. So for the vast majority of ordinary incidents, there was no requirement for an IMP to be generated, and therefore we wouldn't expect to see one unless there had been something that had occurred to attract an incident. So yes, it was low, but actually I think it doesn't accurately reflect how many of those operational, and I think that's a failing, having gone back and looked at it in preparation for this, that it doesn't identify what we should have done, which was how many of those incidents should have attracted an IMP database entry, which would have been considerably lower than 96%.
Exactly. And that's the point, isn't it? 96% is a very large, maybe vast, but so also would be 65%. And the difference between 4% and
yes.
35% would have been helpful, yes?
Yes, definitely.
We heard also from Dr. Sabrina Cohen-Hatton, who gave evidence some weeks ago, that an IMP point, also known as a development point, I think, would be reflected in a personal development plan or, of course, a PDP. Dr. Cohen-Hatton also told us on day 184 that the IMP points, the IMP process and the PDPs were seen as she put it, punitive. Would you agree with that?
I think that it's important to understand the context of a large majority of IMP points were not attributed necessarily to individuals, because they could be attributed to either a team, so directly to a whole watch that attended an incident, or as a result of an organisational or equipment failure. The individual points were those attributed as the result of predominantly the performance review of command, which I think she probably explained to you, which was following every significant operational incident. A meeting was held independently chaired where the performance of all of the incident commanders was analysed, and that was what would often result in the individual learning points. And yes, there was a perception that they were viewed negatively because I suppose the context in which to set this is that firefighters and officers are incredibly professional, and they only ever want to be seen as doing their job exceptionally well. So I think any criticism levelled at them was always hard to swallow. I think people found criticism of their operational performance incredibly difficult. So we did do quite a bit of work to try and explain to people that it wasn't punitive and it was a process to assist people with learning and development in order to not repeat the same issues again.
Yes. Now, Dr. Cohen-Hatton also told us that in the late summer of 2016, when you were ACOA, she conducted a review of personal development plans. That's for those who want to look it up. It's at day 184, page 205, line 14. Do you recall her doing that first?
Yes, I do.
You do. And before that review, were you aware of the negative perception of IMP points that you've just described?
Oh, very much so.
Yes. And do you agree that the perception of IMP points as negative in the way you've described it and punitive in the way she's described it, it was likely to have accounted for the low take-up of the IMPD, as we've seen on the screen?
No, that wasn't the way the IMPD worked. So the IMPD worked that following any operational incident, any fireground officer could make an entry on the IMPD. The ones that she's specifically referring to, quite rightly, are the ones following the performance review of command, which wasn't about the individuals themselves making those judgments. That was about the performance review of command and the ORT recording those. So the reason of people not putting entry on there was not to do with the negative connotation, because it would be unlikely, I would suggest, that an individual would enter themselves a negative comment. But that would be more the reflection of the operational review team who attended the fireground, or for any other officers to be able. So to give an example to try and clarify, I know when I try and explain it, it sounds terribly complicated. So if you were to attend an operational incident as a frontline firefighter or crew or watch manager, and at that incident you were concerned because you thought that potentially something hadn't happened that you thought should have happened, whether it was to do with the water supply, piece of equipment or another crew, you could come back and make an entry on the database. People didn't do that very often. But the entries that were made individually to people following the performance review of command weren't a choice. They were something that happened as a function of the PRC.
Do you see any connection at all, therefore, between the low take-up of the IMPD and the figures that we can see on the screen and the negative perception or negative connotations among NFB staff about criticism?
No, not really, because it was a different mechanism that put those points on there. I think for me, the part of the incident of the low take-up is, I say, that it wasn't reflected very well at all in what instance should be on there. But and part of that, I think, was to do with a somewhat maybe, a lack of understanding amongst crews about the importance of entering information when they came back from incidents, because I think sometimes crews would go to an incident, something minor would happen, they wouldn't understand that that could actually have a reflection across the whole London Fire Brigade, so that if they'd had an incident where they'd had a water failure or something, it might have happened 20 other times, and if they took the time to put that entry on there, we would see that trend. So the individual points, the negative connotation, I think, was far more around the performance review of command.
I see. Did you or your department try to do anything to improve these figures, or figures such as these?
Yes, continuously. It was one of the frustrations that we had, and Graham Ellis and his team worked very hard to try and communicate via various methods, including through operational news, about the importance of people entering points where there was the need to. So that would mean where there was something identified, that could be an issue.
And you say that he communicated via various methods, including operational news. What were those methods? So
I think that potentially it's come up before. There were things where all the borough commanders came in for training sessions, the sessions that Dave Brown ran when he was Assistant Commissioner. We would have a regular slot to go and talk to the borough commanders and to share those concerns with them. They would then disseminate that information through their station commanders to the fire stations. We would also use sort of the opportunities from the operational review team if they were out on the fire ground. So any method we can to try and promote the use of the database for sharing of information to identify trends. Did
it really work, though?
No.
Why not?
Frustratingly. A number of reasons, I think. I think that, so there was the issue about potentially frontline personnel not understanding significance. I think that it was, I think that it worked to a certain extent where we managed to said here we've got an encouraging entries number have risen. So I think when we had a push on it, you'd get a rise of entries and then it would tail off again and then we would have another push. But it was never as satisfactory as it could be.
Right. Why were frontline personnel not understanding the significance of reporting, given the efforts that DAC Ellis was making?
I think part of the reason, and we saw this as well with the other method of identifying issues, which was the near-miss database. So the two of them were hand in hand, that we found we had very low reporting on near misses. Near misses are also a significant key indicator of the potential for things to be going wrong. We were trying to promote that both near misses and entries on here would be something that could identify issues that might well lead to a significant issue in the future that might involve them. But I think people still failed to make that correlation.
Does the poor take-up of the IMPD, as exemplified by this slide, mean that the ODCB was only ever receiving a very small part of the operational picture?
No, and definitely not. This was only a part of the jigsaw. So the other part of the jigsaw was the verbal report that Graham Ellis brought from his team. The operational review team met once a week on Wednesday mornings, and there they would have a 2-3 hour meeting to talk about all of the operational incidents they'd attended in the previous week. DAC Ellis would chair that, so he would be very much aware of the conversations around what had happened, what was going on, what potential areas of concern there were, and he would use that to feed into the ODCB as well.
Yes, I understand that. But if one's looking at it statistically, one wanted to go back over an objectively identifiable set of records, do you accept that if all one had to go on was this document, that would mean that the ODCB was receiving only a small part of the operational picture, precisely because there were so many incidents that had just not fed through into the figures.
So I think that if that was all you were looking at, yes, but that wasn't all they were looking at. And the vast majority of the operational incidents attended daily by London Fire Brigade, there were no issues and they would not have required those entries.
Can we look at MET 3078859, please? This is a witness statement from Julian Spooner, who was a firefighter, dated the 19th of October 2020, that he gave to the Metropolitan Police. And he explains in his statement that he was, in fact, as of October 2020, a group manager within the Incident Command Policy Department. Do you remember him?
I do, yes.
Now, if we go to page 4 of his statement, if you look at the page and look at the fourth paragraph down, he explains He explains operational news there, and at the very foot of the page, if you go to that, we scroll down to the foot of the page. He says this: prior to the introduction of OIP, the organisation would probably only have had information drawn from our Information Management System, IMS. IMS has a lot of positive points, but it is only as good as the information people put into it. If Shepherd's Court wasn't entered multiple times to make it a trend, as the organisation looked at trends and not individual incidents necessarily, then the information wouldn't have been identified. Do you agree that the DIOT process was too heavily focused on operational trends and was therefore susceptible to missing a serious learning point from a one-off incident or event?
No, definitely not. I know that for significant one-off events, they would have been the subject of a specific conversation at ODCB. And actually, I think in doing my preparation for this, I read specifically in one of the papers that a conversation had been had with the Deputy Commissioner about the fact that just because there was only potentially one entry, it didn't mean that wasn't a significant learning event. So, no, I think that the way that the organisational learning was shared was far wider than just looking at the data trend from that.
So you don't agree with what Mr. Spooner says here?
No, I don't.
And let me say that we're clear, you don't agree with it because individual incidents, if significant, would have been the subject of discussion at ODCB meetings.
They definitely were, because I attended all of those ODCB meetings. At this point, I'll say Julian Spooner came to work in the department much later, but he would not have been familiar with what had happened at previous meetings and the conversations we'd had.
Now, of course, the DIOP process was heavily documented. This discussion at ODCB meetings would have been much less formal. Is that correct?
It would have been it was a minuted meeting, so the conversations around individual issues would have formed part of the minutes of the meeting.
Right, but when working out what to train on through the operational news process, or what priorities to give to competing operational news articles for the purposes of training, were those minutes which would record discussion about one-off incidents used?
Oh yes, very much so.
Well, you say that. I mean, was there a process by which those deciding on training and priorities of training for operational news processes would look at all the data, including discussion and input from your team about operational incidents, which were significant?
Yes, so what would happen would be that the Deputy Assistant Commissioner Graham Ellis would present the information, and we would then have a in-depth discussion involving all of the relevant heads of department. And bearing in mind that normally if there had been a significant incident, the operational officer that attended would quite regularly be at the ODCB meeting because all of the assistant commissioners were there. So then the relevant information would be fed in. So that would be a professional discussion around the issues and any items of concern from that.
Given what you told us about the low take-up, as we've seen from the graphics, and your continued frustration about that at station level, did you ever take any steps to look outside the brigade for any operational information and learning systems so that you could assure yourself that what you were telling ODCB was robust and reliable?
So as part of my role, we would do outward horizon scanning of other fire and rescue services and the information they shared. We would take the opportunity, so obviously there was before there was the National Fire Chiefs Council, there was the Chief Fire Officers Association, and they had an operational board that sat, and that would be used to collate information about operational issues nationwide. That information would be fed back in. The Commissioner, Ron Dobson, sat on that board, so he would then bring information back in about the wider national operational arena.
I don't think, well, correct me if I'm wrong, that we see the results of that outward horizon scanning, as you call it, in any of the incident monitoring 6-monthly reports.
That would only feature in there if a specific area had been identified, but it could be subject of part of a conversation. But no, you don't regularly see it as part of the minutes of the meeting. I do think genuinely when I look back that information sharing nationally was generally poor. I don't think there was as much sharing of operational learning as there should have been or could have been.
What about international incidents? Did your outward horizon scanning ever capture those and feed those back to the ODCB as a potential training point?
So internationally, so DAC Graham Ellis used to monitor through an international forum some of the operational incidents that were occurring. He was very interested in seeing what was happening. And sometimes they would be the subject of a conversation, but I have to say predominantly with the view of, thank goodness that could never happen in the United Kingdom because we have different regulations. So although he would share information about fires overseas, the conversation would predominantly, as I remember it, always be around, thank goodness that could not be us.
Really? Now, just to tell you, or put to you what has been said previously, Rita Dexter told us that the Fire Safety Department and the ODCB did not conduct research into international fires, but she asked you as ACOA, considering whether they were having the regard to the best available range of information or whether there was more that could be taken into account when learning from. Do you agree with that she tasked you with that?
She had a conversation. We had more than one conversation about... Rita's phrase was quite regularly, I don't know what I don't know, which meant that she wanted people to try and keep her informed of what was going on generally across the fire service, and she was always keen to understand organisational improvements. So we did have conversations around and feed those in, and I know that DAC Graham Ellis would regularly share links with her as well where he'd seen incidents occurring overseas because she was very interested in the operational arena.
But am I right in saying that you never carried out a task whereby you set in place a process for gathering information about overseas fires, analysing them and then feeding them back to, for example, the ODCB or other directorates?
No, that was the role of the Chief Fire Officers Association. They had an international function that required them to look across the piece, and we would expect them, obviously as a large reaching organisation, to do that for the UK Fire Service. Otherwise, obviously, it meant 43 individual fire and rescue services would have to conduct that piece of work. But we did have an interested eye in issues that were occurring overseas because it's a natural inquiring mind of the fire service to, if you see an incident, this morning, for instance, there was a terrible fire in Bulgaria that involved people on a bus, and that would be the sort of thing that we would then subsequently have a professional conversation around how that could have occurred.
Yes, I see. And so far as AC Gary Reason is concerned, he told us that there weren't any processes or procedures in place for learning from international events, but that you, the Brigade, relied on government departments and the CFOA to provide guidance on international incidents. He said that at day 182, page 101, lines 8 to 17. That's for our reference. Do you agree with him?
Absolutely. It was definitely the role of the National Fire Chiefs, or CFR as it was, and the government to liaise and provide that information to all of the UK Fire Service.
And turning to the question of other risk-critical industries, Gary Reason also told us, day 182, page 103, lines 1 to 15, that the LFB did not seek to learn from other risk-critical industries in the UK because, as you put it, you probably wouldn't have the capacity even if you wanted to. And it wasn't something that the LFB ever considered during his time. That's what he told us. Can you confirm that from your knowledge?
I would definitely agree with him that unfortunately we wouldn't have had the resources. I said the incident management team itself was a very small team and were kept kind of quite busy with day-to-day LFB functions. With hindsight, as with always, it would have been interesting and useful to have been able to do that piece of work, but with the amount of resource we had at the time, just not practical.
No. So does it follow from that and the discussion we've just had that the only way of monitoring operational information and learning and ensuring that it was robust and reliable was in essence by looking within the LFB itself and to some extent horizon scanning for what other fire and rescue services were doing, subject to the limitations you've described?
Yes.
Yes. Now, of the IMPD trends and issues that were proposed for operational news articles in the incident monitoring 6 monthly reports, is it right that only half, roughly half, were actually chosen by the ODCB for the newsletter?
Yes, probably half to two-thirds mainly. I suppose it would depend on how many issues we presented in the paper to be considered. And then mainly maybe 4 or 5 would be taken forward for the operational news publication.
Let's look at the LFB's DIOT policy, and that is at LFB 000555171, please. I'll just show you the first page of that document. DIOT, Dynamic and Intelligent Operational Training. That's what it stands for. And this is the process. This is the policy 825, April 2013, as you can see. And if we can go to page 7, paragraph 3.27, it says this. The ODCB report summarises the information described in section 3 and identifies the 8 most prominent subjects, as well as any other significant trends to be included as articles within operational news. At 6 monthly intervals, i.e. the March and September ODCB meetings, 4 or 5 operational themes are prioritised for inclusion within operational news based on performance and safety event data on a risk-assessed basis. These themes become the priority for targeted training activity and form the content of the communications message to operational staff. Now, in your time, how did the ODCB select which 4 or 5 operational themes, to use the words of the policy, would be included within the operational news newsletter?
So they would look at the recommendations that had been made. There would then be a professional conversation and discussion amongst the colleagues who were part of the ODCB. They would ask questions around the specific issues that were being suggested. So, for instance, if it may only have been, say, 2 or 3 reports of something, and then the Deputy Commissioner would ask why that area had been recommended, and we would have a conversation around what we considered the risks to be, including the other professional colleagues from different departments, and then a judgment would be made on what were considered to be the priority issues to be raised and therefore to be subject to matters in operational news.
Now, you say half to 2/3 were selected. Of the other half, or other 1/3 of the themes, in other words, those not chosen for the newsletter, how did your department look to ensure that operational performance in those areas was improved nonetheless?
So depending on the nature of the issue that was being raised, there would be a number of different ways. So whether that was sharing information through the operational arena, so through Dave Brown and out to the fire station, so there would be no issue with being able to share that information. Whether it was formal conversations with colleagues in different departments. So if I gave an example of something, we had a number of issues of relating to people using certain emollient creams that were soaking into bedding for people who were bedbound, and then they were catching fire. That would then be a conversation that we would have with teams in the community safety department so that they could then share that awareness with their community safety teams when they were going out into the wider community, and they would share it with health professionals so that information could be given to say these are the risks and the risks to members of the public. So it depended on what the nature of the risk was as to how the information could be shared. but we would seek to try and make sure. Sometimes it was a case where it was be deferred to the next operational news, where they would want further information to be gathered, or see whether or not there were any other issues that arose during the 6-month period, as to whether they would then choose that as a next Ops News article.
Yes, I can understand that there may, of course, be candidates that were deferred for the next operational newsletter, but I'm really interested in those which had fallen by the wayside, so to speak. You say the information about those was shared and there was awareness. That's not the same as training, though, is it?
No, not at all.
No, not at all. And therefore, was there not a risk, a real risk, that half to two-thirds of the trends that had emerged and come up for operational news as candidates for training didn't get trained and was subject, therefore, to a much more diffuse, a much woollier approach, namely relying on the individual station managers to raise awareness?
So I would say that if that something was considered to be that high risk, then it would have featured as part of a Ops News article. And although there were the main articles in Ops News, there were smaller pieces of information shared as well, so it wasn't just those 4 or 5 key items. And if it was something that was to provide a significant risk, then we would be very forward in our approach of saying that we want it to be included. Sometimes there would be things that were less of a risk to the organisation, and ideally you'd train on absolutely everything and you'd have a whole booklet of Ops News, but it had to be done in a certain way to prioritise articles that were going to then receive training on. I don't think that, I would not have been in a position to allow something that I consider to be a significant risk to just be dropped off the radar.
You say that. You were one voice at the ODCB. How would you have stopped it?
Well, by sharing my concerns with professional colleagues and having that raised. I think that, that one voice can be heard in a group setting. If you share your concerns out and identify risks, that then other operational colleagues will understand that and the conversation. And I would also be able to talk to my direct boss, Gary Reason, about my concerns, and that he would also have an influence in that voice as well. So
just help me with the process here. Your department effectively identifies through the DOT process and other processes as well, as we've seen, what themes should be the subject of training, and you put those up to the ODCB for its final decision. At the stage where you're making that decision about what should be included in your list, do you do a risk assessment so as to work out what risk level each theme presents, so that you end up with a list of must-haves, can lose, debatable, or some sort of system whereby you can grade these trainings by risk?
So I think that was the purpose of ODCB, would be to conduct that risk assessment as a meeting and as a board to consider the risks. And I just want to be clear that because an item wasn't subject to an operational news article didn't mean that there weren't training interventions taking place. What the Ops News article did was to highlight specific areas that had occurred, and not all of those were situations that were providing risks to firefighters. So as you would have seen, the article that was mentioned about fire investigation, about removals of samples from the fire ground, that was as part of a process where investigation would happen into cause of fires. So that was a awareness raising to crews. But the things that were key aspects of training were all subject in their own right to individual training packages that would be being undertaken by fire station crews as part of their ongoing training on a daily basis. So it wasn't things that were just being slipped through the net and forgotten. The ODCB highlighted areas and then put training packages together to reflect those areas, or highlighted the training packages that were already in place.
Can we go to your witness statement, please, at page 4, paragraph 13? And you tell us in the final 3 lines there what happens once the half or 2/3 of articles are selected for inclusion in operational news. You say this: once a decision had been made, my team then had responsibility for collating the text for the articles from other departments. This work was undertaken by DAC Ellis. So is it right that the actual writing of the articles was the responsibility of others?
Yes, it was.
And the Incident Management Policy Group would identify subject matter experts, or SMEs, inevitably. Yes?
Yes, that's correct.
Did your department play any role in drafting the articles?
They would only draft articles if they were ones for anything that was owned by incident management. Apart from that, they would ask for the articles to be drafted by the person who had the expertise in that. So whether it would be policy, operational policy, fire safety, or whoever the team was that was relevant.
Right. Did your department check those for which you were responsible, I think, incident management, for efficacy and accuracy?
Those that were responsible, absolutely.
Yes, I see. So your department, to that extent, and even your director, Gary Reason, I think, had a role in considering the content of those articles, at least.
Yes.
Yes. Mr. Chairman, is this an appropriate moment for the break? We're moving subtopic.
Yes, I think it is. Thank you very much. Well, it's time we had a break for the morning. We'll stop now. We'll resume, please, at 11:30. And I shall say this to you every time you leave the room, but as you probably remember from previous occasions, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence while you're out of the room.
No, well, thank you, sir.
Thank you very much
Thank you.
indeed. Thank you, Mr. Millett. 11:30, please. Would you ask Ms. Cotton to come back in, please?
Thank you.
All right, Ms. Cotton, ready to carry on?
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Miller.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'd like to ask you now about training associated with operational news. We've seen that some operational news articles were accompanied by computer-based training, or CBT, packages that were created by Babcock. And indeed, Rita Dexter told us that the ODCB would make the final decision about whether or not an article was to be accompanied by a CBT package. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Yeah. And Peter Graves and Gary Reason also told us that that developing training packages with Babcock was seen as a cumbersome and resource and time-intensive process. Would you agree with that characterisation?
Yes, I do.
And I think in your second statement, if we look at your second statement, please, page 11, paragraph 53, you say, amendments to training therefore had to be considered fully, and the proper process undertaken before LFB training would change, and this could take some time. The privatisation of the LFB's training under the contract with Babcock created inefficiencies within the LFB's training programme, particularly in terms of implementing changes to training. Babcock attended CMBs approximately every 6 months to discuss training. I understand that AC Ellis is considering the challenges faced under the Babcock contract in his witness statement. Did the fact that the privatisation of LFB's training under the contract with Babcock created inefficiencies within LFB's training programme dissuade you, or the ODCB more generally, from suggesting or producing as many operational news training packages as you would have liked?
I think that it was a consideration as to what we recommended for training, because we were aware of the length of time it could take to produce a training package. And I think that wouldn't have affected necessarily the choice of article, because there were other aspects of training that were already on the system that we could refer to for crews to take part in to assist them. But development of new training packages was indeed a cumbersome process.
Right. And did that fact dissuade you or the ODCB from, on occasions, suggesting or producing a particular operational news training package?
No, I don't think it dissuaded us. I think it was just the recognition that the length of time it would take to actually produce that training package.
Was it a factor? Was that cumbersome process a factor in the figures for outturn? In other words, the half to 2/3 that you described earlier?
No, not at all. So we wouldn't be dissuaded from having an Ops News article on something that we considered to be a key issue because of the length of time it would take to produce a training package,
right. Because
there would be other training on the system that we could refer to in the meantime for crews to familiarise themselves with.
Nonetheless,
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Millett. Can you just help me understand this? Operational news was published in the form of a leaflet, was it?
Yes, a pamphlet, sir.
A pamphlet. And was there a limit on the length of the pamphlet?
No, ideally, I think for some reason, and I'm not sure about why this was decided, it was generally approximately 8 pages long, but on occasions there were Ops News specials where we featured something in particular that could have been longer or shorter, but it was generally held to between 8 and 10 pages, I believe.
Right, so you didn't have a physical limitation on the amount of space available. The number of pages was flexible.
Yes, it was, sir.
But obviously you don't want it to get too large because it becomes too expensive to produce, I imagine.
And also I think it was around the aspects of focusing crews' attention to specific articles, and that if there were too many, you might lose the focus of what was a priority.
Yes, now you've described it as a form of training. I had understood that its purpose was principally to bring crews' attention to things that you wanted them to be aware of. I mean, you referred to the removal of materials from the fireground. Was it regarded as a training tool or as an informing tool, if you can see the difference?
Yes, I can. It was very much an information piece, but with training attached to it. So the news articles would be contained within operational news. The back page then had the links to the relevant training that would assist crews in understanding what the information was. So there would be a complete back page, and that training would be ranked red, amber and green for whether or not it was something that was an absolute priority they had to do, and then obviously amber, and then on to green, which was more information pieces.
And those would be computerised links, would they?
There'd be computerised links, and yes, and those would be then uploaded to the individual's training records.
That's very helpful. Thank you very
Thank you,
much. Sorry, Mr. Williams.
Coming back to paragraph 53, did the problems or inefficiencies created by the privatisation of the LFB's training under the contract with Babcock act as a factor in any way in deciding whether the ODCB would allocate an amber or a green code or colour to a particular topic?
No, not at all.
So is this right? I think on your evidence, is it your recollection that the problems you've identified in paragraph 53 here of your second statement had no bearing whatever on the numbers of articles in operational news which was selected for training or on their grading, red, amber or green?
That's right.
If a CBT package was produced, were the Operational Assurance Department always the commissioning department?
No, we weren't. The commissioning department would be the subject matter experts who were relevant for that particular piece of training.
Right. Let's just test that against something. Can we please look at MET 3079358, please? What I'm showing you is the police witness statement of Nick Markwell of the 17th of May 2021. Now, you'll recall that Mr. Markwell worked in the LFB's training commissioning department between 2012 and 2018, as he tells us. And if you go to page 3 of his statement, the first paragraph on that page, he says, the subject content stroke learning outcomes that were required for an operational news TCAP would come from GM Lee Drawbridge and his department via recommendations from ODCB. First, is Mr. Markwell right about that or wrong about that?
So, yes, Lee Drawbridge worked for Graham Ellis in the Operational Assurance Department, and Lee would be the one who would communicate the outcome of the ODCB recommendations for the news articles and would share that with Nick Markwell.
Yes, so it's the Operational Assurance Department that would direct the subject, content or learning outcomes required for an operational news TCAP. Is that right?
No, we would just share the list with Nick Markwell. He would then be in direct contact with the commissioning departments for the content of those articles.
I see. You say he would be in direct contact with the commissioning department. Was there a training commissioning department per se, or was the department doing the commissioning of any training something that varied depending on the subject matter of the training?
So each individual department would have the ability to commission training requirements. That would then go into the team that Nick Markwell worked for, which was the overall training commissioning department. Those were the ones who helped develop the training TCAP packages and then worked alongside Babcock's with a subject matter expert from the commissioning department.
I follow. So when we're talking of commissioning, it works at two levels, I think. Is this right? There's the client level, and one sees that word used in the TCAPs themselves, and that would be in incident command,
Yes.
Operational assurance. And then there's the training commissioning department, which actually takes the commission and gives it effect.
Yes, that's right.
I follow. Let's look at an example of an operational newsletter. Can we go, please, to LFB 00118959? Now, this is the one for 24th of March 2013. There are 7 articles in this issue, but let's pick one. Let's go to page 2. We can see an article at the top of the page called Fire Survival Guidance Calls. And the first paragraph says, Policy 790 explains what a fire survival guidance FSG call is and describes the actions required by staff on the incident ground upon receipt of FSG information from control. Now, the article then goes on, as you can see, to set out a summary of what an FSG call is, the appliances that will be mobilised in response to an FSG call, the role of control information forms, or CIFs, and then if you look at the red bullet points on the right-hand side of the screen, the penultimate paragraph says this: it is vital that control is kept informed of the actions being taken to resolve each FSG call. The fact that control is aware of the actions being carried out on the incident ground will greatly enhance the advice given to FSG callers. The policy lists the methods of communication available, and there's then a next paragraph or final paragraph there on casualty information forms. Would it be fair to describe this as a potted version of Policy 790?
Yes,
Yes, which came out, I think, in the February of 2012.
I believe so.
What training is this article actually giving?
So this article isn't given training per se. It's raising awareness of some of the contents you say in a summary form of Policy 790. And then if you look on the back page of this operational news information, it will give you the training links for the crews to then follow.
Yes. Before we go to that, what does this potted version give the firefighters or anybody who is supposed to read this, what they wouldn't get from a reading of the relevant policy, which is only about 7 pages long?
So this is awareness raising. So this has obviously come to light as a result of something that has happened. Sometimes that was the publication of a new policy. Sometimes it was as a result of an event on the fire ground. What this would do is draw crews' attention to the fact that we wanted them to focus on fire survival guidance calls and then direct them to the training that came with it. So obviously if we had Ops News just publishing lists of policies and details of policies, it wouldn't be very long for a start and wouldn't be necessarily very interesting. This is a summary to give people the flavour of what it is, and then the training's attached to it.
If we go to page 4 of this newsletter, we can see the list of training that was associated with these particular articles. And if you look at the 4th row down, you can see fire survival guidance calls just towards the foot of your screen.
Yeah.
Ms. Cotton, can you see?
I can, yes.
And it says article, fire survival guidance calls, training, article, guidance and supporting information, policy 790 fire survival guidance calls, and then step, recording reference, create on step. And you can see that it says lecture stroke subject stroke incident management, incident command, stroke incident command procedure stroke fire survival guidance calls 790. So what would that be? Would that be a place on the intranet, the NFB's intranet?
Yes, so this is drawing the attention to the officer in charge of the watches on fire stations that they need to conduct training on Policy 790, and that's the how they record it on the recording system. Basically, that link will take them to the area in which they record that information against people's individual training records.
Right. And this is something that the firefighters would be asked to do. Is it they'd be expected to read the new policy, and is it right that the watch manager would then be expected to give a lecture on this topic based on what was on step?
It wouldn't be necessarily based on step. This would be based on the policy. The watch manager, it was mandatory for the watch manager on that article to conduct a training session in relation to that article with all their watches and then record it on the step system. So
the step system, forgive me, the step system is to record the fact that the lecture was given, when it was given and by whom.
Yes, that's right.
So it's a training record, if you like.
Yes.
This lecture would be held on, as you say, the LFB's database or intranet. Is it right that the watch manager taking the station staff or station crews through this would not be provided with any materials for that lecture?
They would be provided with the policy, which would give them the basis on which to conduct the training. Watch managers were regularly, on a tour, every tour, so every single tour of duty for a watch on a station, they would be conducting some form of training. So this would be a regular routine for them. And this was to ensure that these specific articles were the focus of the training for the crews.
Yes, I mean, this isn't a CBT package, is it?
No, that's just the policy for them to work out the training from.
Yes, and just if you look at this page, which are the packages, I think we see only one CBT at the bottom of page 4. If you go down, you'll need to scroll down. You can see that the training is all article, and then you get to article, aerial appliances, article and package. 72D visits, article and package, and then aerial appliances, CBT package. So that shows that of all these particular items selected by the ODCB for training, only one got a CBT package, namely aerial appliances. Is that right? Is that how to read this?
And the 72D visits by...
Well, that's a package as opposed to a CBT package. Can you tell us the difference?
I'm not sure I understand what the difference means there. Training pack available.
Well, compare 72D visit, article and package, which is identified as a watch training package in the next column to the right.
Yes.
With the next section of this, which is Senior Officer Computer-Based Training, CBT, and there you see Aerial Appliances, CBT package. Can you tell us what is the difference between a package, a watch training package, and a CBT package?
I think the difference is it's just different wording for the same thing, but the top section refers to watch-based staff and the bottom to senior officers. So obviously senior officers would not be undertaking watch-based staff training, and although there were occasions when they would meet together and have training sessions, it would be a responsibility of an individual senior officer to access that CBT training package, whereas the watch training package would be accessed by the watch manager and delivered to the watches. But effectively, I think they're both the same training package, they're just called something slightly different.
Do you know that?
I know that there were on the computer, the station training packages that were accessible were called watch training packages, and they were CBT packages. But the specific difference is that senior officers would only access those CBT packages. They wouldn't be present at unless it was a significant training input, they wouldn't have a large gathering of people together to be trained.
Focusing on watch training packages then, and focusing on fire survival guidance calls as we have been, if you look at the right-hand side of the column, and will you just scroll up, please, to go back to that. Scroll up the page to go back to it. It's now towards the foot of your screen, fire survival guidance calls. And you can see the lecture there that I read to you. Just to be clear, you say that the watch manager would have the policy. What else would the watch manager have by way of prompts or assistance or guidance to them when taking the station-based crew through the lecture?
So the policy itself would contain all of the detailed information regarding fire survival guidance calls, and that would be the basis on which the watch manager would produce their lecture.
I see. So there'd be no how to deliver a lecture package which the watch manager would have?
No.
Right. So it was up to individual watch managers and their particular presentational skills as to how well it went?
Yes, it was.
And I'm assuming they never had any centralised training on how to teach?
It varies. There were times where we did. When I was a leading firefighter, I underwent a week-long course in how to deliver training, both practical and theoretical classroom-based training. And then I know on other crew commander and watch commander inputs, they have had direct information about how to deliver training. It wasn't consistent. There were some people who probably haven't had it, but I know when I went through the process, albeit it was a long time ago, we did have a week's input on it.
Yes, you say it was a long time ago. Can you tell us when you did your week-long course in how to deliver training?
1995.
Right.
A long time ago. Sorry.
So it was
yes.
Even before. A long time ago. All right. Peter Groves told us that there was no training on how to train after Babcock came in April 2012. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Yes. Now, this edition of Operational News, as we've seen, was released in March 2013. That, looking across the piece, was the last month of the Lakenhall House inquest hearings, wasn't it?
Yes.
The failure to transfer information back to the control room as a topic was a major feature of that incident, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
The Lakenhall fire. Indeed, can you confirm, to the best of your recollection, it was the very reason why Policy 790 came into being in the first place?
Yes, it was.
And you won't have seen this from anything I've shown you today, but can you confirm from your recollection that it was one of the 34 pre-Lakenhall actions?
It was, yes.
Yes. And yet there's no mention in this article of Lakenhall House as an incident or the provenance, the origins of Policy 790. We can see that. Why is that?
I'm not sure. The department who wrote the article would have made the decision on that. Now, looking back, it would have been very helpful and very relevant to have included that, because obviously all the operational crews were very familiar with the Lacknell House fire, so to have made that link in would have been very useful.
You say, looking back, it would have been very helpful. The point of Lacknell and all the work that the LFB was doing after 2009 up to this point, March 2013, was looking back. It was looking back to the incident. So why hindsight now and not hindsight then?
I'm not sure. Can't answer that.
We've seen, and we can go back 2 pages, let's do that, to page 2, to the paragraph I read to you underneath the red bullet points. If we go back to page 2, the paragraph which starts, "It is vital that control is kept informed of the actions being taken to resolve each FSG call." That's wording taken from the article, but it doesn't focus, this doesn't focus on information transfer between the incident ground and control. Do you know why that is?
No, I don't. Sorry.
Do you accept that operational news articles, in the form we see them, could only ever be a high-level and cursory exploration of an operational topic?
Yes, they were designed to be a summary, a sort of a news bite of it, to then inform the crews what was coming their way as regards to training.
Yes, and as a system, the operational news, at least as a document and as a system, inherently relied on local crews being proactive not only in completing the training, but in also in taking steps to try to embed it in their own minds and their own operational approach.
I wouldn't say it required them being proactive, because it was mandatory, so it was followed up. The station commanders were responsible for ensuring that all of their crews had completed that training, and there were also teams working directly to the area DACs who were responsible for ensuring that training was undertaken in each of those geographical areas.
So are you telling us that there was quantitative oversight, at least, of whether or not training on a particular package or particular topic had been completed at particular stations?
Yes, there was. And what happened was that there was a team of people who would run the reports from the step recording system that would give updates to the area DACs and to Assistant Commissioner Dave Brown about the percentage of completion rate by the watches, and they would then be fed back to ensure that those who had not completed did so.
Yes, but I think you also accept that the quality of the training, reliant as it was on watch managers who had not been trained to train and had not been given a prompt list or training package on how to go about the task, was dependent on the individual skills of the watch manager concerned and the keenness of the crews to take on what was being shown to them.
Yes, I would say there would be a prompt list, because there was the list of information in the policy that were the key areas for them to focus on the key points. There was a key point summary included. I can't remember what time that came in, but it was individually based on the watch officer's ability.
Yes. Do you accept this proposition that by the system we've been looking at, with its reliance on local crews, local station managers, and particularly the skills of the watch manager concerned, that it was in essence impossible for the operational news system of training or diffusing training topics to have a direct impact on the performance of crews on the fire ground? It could only ever be indirect and only as good as the training they got on the day or the night when they were being trained.
No, I think that there were direct impacts, because I think that where, and I know anecdotally from talking to crews that where awareness had been raised of a certain piece of information through operational news, that they then came across that situation on the fire ground, and what they had learned through the operational news and the subsequent training was very relevant to them to understand different situations that occurred.
Mm. Now, do you accept the general proposition that, given the trend of decline, as we've seen, I think, uncontested in this inquiry, of operational incidents in the 21st century in London, firefighters require rather more in the way of training than simply reading policies and completing computer-based training packages.
Yes, and that was why there were a number of other training interventions continually taking place across London Fire Brigade, whether that was access to operational training through Babcocks, whether that was large-scale or small-scale training exercises that regularly took place in different areas. And then it has to be borne in mind that the training on fire stations wasn't solely based on crews sitting in a fire station listening to a watch manager. Those would be translated into operational training events at fire stations on a very regular basis. So it wasn't just a case of sitting and having a policy read to them.
Did you ever yourself raise the need for more practical training with anyone, the need to embed learning through practice and guidance beyond the operational news system we've seen?
I think that was a conversation we regularly had at ODCB, and Dave Brown would supply the information about the operational exercises that were taking place, both those small and large scale, to give an indication of what was happening across London Fire Brigade. It was very important that practical training took place.
Right. Did you ever encounter any reluctance, either within the Operational Assurance Department itself from your own staff or from those on the ODCB, about the need for such exercises as you've described?
No, definitely not. Everyone was very supportive of the idea.
Right. Let's go to the ODCB minutes of October, 14th of October 2013 at LFB 0006788. Now, this, as you can see, is the minutes of an interim meeting on that day. I've given you the date. You can see that you were there. If you go to page 2, you were there as AC Operational Assurance. You can see that fourth from the bottom.
Yes.
And we can also see, if you look a little bit lower down the screen, I think it'll be a scroll down to see it, matters arising under 2A, frequency of operational news. And you are recorded as querying the feasibility of increasing the frequency to 3 issues, as agreed at the last meeting. The DC suggested, and the DC was Rita Dexter, the DC suggested that this might be an opportune time to have a fundamental review of the current system. The third officer, that was Dave Brown, referred to the fact that the same issues repeatedly arise as an indication that a review is needed. Such a review would look at whether the right tools are available and what system is used in other organisations, and it may lead to a review of the Brigade's operational response delivery model. ACOA was asked to lead on the review, which should report back by March 2014. So 6 months or 5 months' time. What was unfeasible about increasing the frequency of operational news?
I don't think it was unfeasible. I thought it was a good idea. I think the feasibility may purely have been around the production. There may have been concerns raised around the time taken to produce the articles by the individual departments and then to translate that into the operational news pamphlet itself. But there were sometimes issues where departments were clearly, especially the operational policy department, because that relied quite heavily on those for the production of articles, as a lot of it was relevant to the policies they owned. And I think sometimes that they felt they didn't have sufficient time to produce those articles and then for them to be published. So that might have been, it wasn't any reluctance on my part to increase it. I was very proactive in the idea of wanting that to be increased.
Why does it record you as querying the feasibility of increasing the frequency?
I think that means it was a conversation with colleagues about whether they felt their departments were going to be sufficiently in a place to be able to produce the articles and turn around in the time it would require.
Why did the ODCB consider it necessary to review the frequency of operational news?
I think it was a conversation we had at previous meetings around the fact that 6 months was a long time period between operational news, and that it would be useful to be able to have a sort of more speedy conduit by which to be able to raise those issues.
Right. Did the ODCB have concerns that the system wasn't functioning properly?
I think there was a mixed view about whether it would be more beneficial to have a more frequent publication against the issues there that are clearly recorded by the third officer, that he felt that it would just mean that we would have things repeated more often, and that I think very rightly at that point, the conversation was around that if we are repeating an Ops News article and the events are still taking place, one of those, I can give you an example, one of the things that regularly occurred was something called sighting of appliances. So that was about when crews arrive at operational incidents, making sure they park the fire engines in the correct way to allow for things like ambulances to park, to allow for aerial appliances to park, and to also ensure that the fire engine was not at risk if the fire developed further, that you wouldn't have risk of having to move your fire engine in the middle of an operational incident. That subject seemed to come up very frequently, so it seemed to be a message that wasn't clearly received by the methods we use to try and tell people not to do it effectively, or how to do it.
There's a reference to you conducting a review. Did you conduct a review of the current system?
I vaguely remember this. I don't remember the detail of it. I do remember Graham Ellis undertaking a piece of work about looking at how we gathered the information, how we shared that, and how it was learnt. I don't remember. It says used in other organisations. I don't remember how and whether that was done or not. I can't recall. I'm sorry.
You were the person instructed to carry out that fundamental review, in particular looking at what other systems were used by other organisations, but you can't, is that right? You can't remember whether you did one or not?
No, it was done, and I think it was done by Graham Ellis and I believe Dr. Adrian Bevan, because he was very familiar with health and safety processes that also followed a similar pattern in other organisations, and he'd also worked for the HSE himself.
Right. Did you delegate the task of conducting the review that you were instructed to carry out down to them?
Yes.
And did they report back to you?
I believe so, but I don't recall.
We've not, I think, seen a report of this fundamental review of the current system. Was there one?
I can't remember, and unfortunately, I can't find one on the system, but I believe what I would say is everything that was detailed to be done and came up as an action point in ODCB was very strongly followed up, so it would have been done and followed up.
Can you help us what your recollection is, to the extent that you have any, of the results of Ellis and Bevan's review?
I'm really sorry, I genuinely can't remember that.
Now, the next substantive update on this issue was at the ODCB meeting of the 30th of July 2014. That's at LFB 3040719. We can see from that you are present, third item, or third person down, Rita Dexter in the chair. And just note, Peter Critchell, PC, Head of Operational Resilience there, is also in attendance. You see that?
Yes.
And if you look at page 2, please, in this minute, you can see item 7, review of ODCB process. The board agreed the 5 recommendations and that operational news should be published 4 times a year. You see that? The DCFEP asked the HOOR, that's Head of Operational Resilience, I think, to report back on progress in establishing a central register of exercises at September's ODCB, details at paragraph 6, page 6. Now, the inquiry doesn't hold a copy of the report referred to in those minutes. Is that the report that you've just described, the Ellis-Bevan report?
Yes, it is.
It is it? Right. Do you remember what the 5 recommendations were that were agreed there?
No, I don't, but I do now, on reading this, recollect that AC Steve Ham, who was the Head of Operational Resilience, who was obviously being deputised for by Peter Critchell, did a large-scale piece of work of establishing this central register of all exercises taking part across London Fire Brigade. I think from recollection of 6 pumps and above. So that was, and I think this came about following the Olympics in 2012, when there were a large number of operational exercises taking place to prepare for the Olympics, and Operational Resilience held that database, and it was decided it'd be very useful to widen the remit of that database to all operational exercises that were being held. I think that definitely where it says about sharing accident and near-miss information more widely, that was one of the recommendations, because I felt that there had been a reluctance in the past to share the information that London Fire Brigade had around safety events with the wider fire and rescue service. And to my mind, that was very important, because if it was happening in one fire service, there was a fair chance it would be happening in another fire service. And I would have hated for London Fire Brigade to hold information around an event that had occurred, and for it not to be shared more widely, and that event to be repeated in another fire service.
And if you look at the last paragraph under 7 there, it says the DCFEP, which I think is the Deputy Commissioner of Fire and Emergency Planning, correct me if I'm wrong about that.
That's correct.
Also asked whether there were any mechanisms in which we could get better feedback from stations, and whether the HOOA, Head of Operational Assurance, could consult with the HOMIC, I struggled with that, I'm guessing Head of Management of Internal Communications.
Management of Information System,
Right.
Information something. It was the Head of Management Information.
Yeah, and look at this as part of the Internal Communications Review in October.
Yes.
Now, just looking at that, what sort of information can you remember Rita Dexter was after from stations?
I can't recall it, but unfortunately it would be useful to have seen the review of ODCB process paper. But I think it would be, I would be speculating, but I suspect maybe it would be information, feedback from stations on how we were sharing information with them. But if I was doing it in conjunction with the Head of Management Information, they were the ones that held all of the detailed information. So I'm really not quite sure.
Right. Do you remember looking into this? It was you who was given the action, I think.
I would have looked into it, definitely, with David Wyatt, who had been the Head of Management Information at the time.
Do you remember what your findings were? Whether you did discover whether there were any mechanisms by which you could get better feedback from stations?
No, I don't, but it would. The findings we found would have been fed into the internal communications review, which was across all of the communications that took place in London Fire Brigade.
Yes. Now, based on what we've been discussing so far this morning about the ODCB and the DIOT process, I just want to put a number of propositions to you and see whether you agree or disagree. First, do you agree that the scope of the ODCB's work was to look at past incidents or training events and identify learning points for the future?
Yes.
Yes. The DIOT process, as part of that, relied fundamentally on the cooperation and proactiveness of individual officers on the ground.
As part of that function, not entirely.
Do you agree that in the context of diminishing numbers of operational incidents, the DIOT sources per se were an increasingly narrow pool of learning opportunities?
They were one aspect of learning opportunities that, yes, because of increasing operational experience, was a small piece, but they were only a part of the jigsaw.
Yeah, but an increasingly narrow.
Yes, as operational incidents decreased, then it was an increasingly narrow pool.
And do you agree that the ODCB's primary training output, namely operational news, articles and associated study or self-study materials, equally relied on individual station-based staff being proactive and being able effectively to impart that training?
I wouldn't agree it relied on their proactivity. It was part of their core function and their daily role. That wouldn't mean them being proactive. It was their job, and they were monitored against that by not only their individual station commanders, but by the area support teams. So that I wouldn't describe that as proactivity. That was their day-to-day role, closely monitored.
Right. And what about the second part of my question? Namely, it relied on them being able effectively to impart that training.
Yes, it did.
It did. And the ODCB itself never directly instigated any practical training events itself, did it?
No, that wasn't the function of ODCB. That would have been instigated by a number of different reasons, through opportunities in different areas, and through station-based staff, and through the individual training plans of each of those fire stations.
Do you agree that it was something of a missed opportunity for the ODCB to identify operational improvements, declining incidents, and actually direct what practical exercises should take place?
No, I think that the work that ODCB did would have fed into that, because those would have come into the station training plans. The station training plans were very closely linked to the risk, not only for individual fire stations, but the wider London Fire Brigade risk, and that would encompass what occurred at ODCB, so that would have been a part of it.
Would have been a part of it. Do you agree that the ODCB missed opportunities to scan the horizon for learning opportunities, both in the UK and overseas?
I think that the ODCB and London Fire Brigade would have quite rightly relied on information to have come in centrally, both through the CFO and the government, that it would have been very difficult for individual fire and rescue services to do that piece of work because it would have been a very wide-ranging function to have done that scanning.
Do you agree that the ODCB missed opportunities to adopt particular practices then in place in other fire and rescue services?
I don't see that particularly. I think that where that was shared, then where we knew about it, and the problem is, going back to Rita's point, what don't I know, is that if there are opportunities occurring in other fire and rescue services that we weren't made aware of, it would have been very difficult for ODCB to have identified those.
What about those you were aware of but rejected? Rice, for example, Kent.
So I wasn't aware of the Rice at all until I started doing the work to prepare for this. So yes, but I think that should have been part of CFO's work, because any individual fire and rescue service could develop something that could either be a really good opportunity for training or something that might only be specific to their area. And unless that was shared nationally through CFO and that CFO did the work to make recommendations on it, then it wouldn't have come into individual fire services necessarily.
But it was shared, wasn't it, directly between Kent and the LFB?
Yes, it was.
So never mind CFO, why wasn't it, given that it wasn't adopted, doesn't that tell us that there were learning opportunities that were missed?
I'm not familiar with the detail of the Rice. I've seen it as part of this, so I'm not sure about what assessment was made by London Fire Brigade about whether or not to adopt that. I think that should be a national piece of work to collect those recommendations, and I know that when I was on National Fire Chiefs Council, the number of individual different interventions that were raised on a regular basis, it would have been very difficult to have adopted each and every one of those. But I think that there should be a wider scale piece of work done to assess each of those and to assess their suitability, whether or not they should be shared and adopted more widely.
Do you agree that in focusing on specific DOT sources, the ODCB failed to maximise its potential as a cross-directorate meeting of senior officers for training?
No, not at all.
You don't. Can I then turn to a different topic, which is your role in the Lacknell pre-inquest action monitoring, and first your involvement with the Lacknell House Board. We touched earlier on that board and on the fire itself, July 2009, and you tell us in your first witness statement, we don't need to turn it up, that you had no operational role yourself at the Lacknell House fire.
No, I didn't.
You also tell us in your first statement, it's paragraphs 16 and 17 on page 5, we can have those up just for the record, that Ron Dobson set up the LFB Lacknell House Board himself in October 2009, some 3 months after the Lacknell House fire in July.
That's correct.
Yes. You also say in paragraph 17, and I'm summarising, I hope accurately, that other than a couple of discrete attendances for specific reasons in 2009 and 2010, you were not involved with the Lacknell House Board in your capacity as DAC in central operations.
No, I wasn't.
And you go on to say in paragraph 18 that because of your appointment to Assistant Commissioner for Operational Assurance in March 2012, you were made a member of the Lacknell House Board.
Yes, I was.
So as it came with the job, did it?
It did, yes.
What was it about the role of AC Operational Assurance that resulted in you becoming a member of the Lacknell House Board?
I'm not entirely sure. I think that the Commissioner decided that it would be useful for me in my new role. I was very unfamiliar with that, to sit on the board. I don't think there was anything specific that either the Commissioner or the Corporate Management Board was seeking from that, but I think that they decided that as a new role of operational assurance, I would be a useful member to the board.
I was going to suggest a reason. Was it because your department was central to the learning and embedding of the operational lessons to be learnt from the Lacknell House fire?
I wouldn't say the department was central to that. That was definitely a role for the operational department and Dave Brown himself, but for us to then monitor the ongoing performance on the fire ground, yes.
Right, you say a role for the operational department. Could you just tell us, as briefly as you can, the differences between Dave Brown's operational department and your operational assurance department?
Yes, certainly. So Dave Brown was responsible for all of the then 113 fire stations in London Fire Brigade, their day-to-day functioning and running, the training they undertook, and basically everything that took place on a fire station. As operational assurance, we were responsible for monitoring operational performance on the fire ground and feeding information from that back in through ODCB.
Right. I mean, those roles essentially overlapped, though, didn't they?
Only to the extent, yes, that we were out monitoring operational
Yeah.
crews on the fire ground, but we didn't do any monitoring of, for instance, of day-to-day training on fire stations or day-to-day management of any of that.
No. You, as you've told us, as operational assurance, you were responsible for monitoring operational performance on the fire ground.
Yes.
And my suggestion to you is that your role on the Lakanal House Board was important because of the operational responses involved at Lakanal.
Yes, so the learning to then be translated into operational performance and how the operational review team observed that on the fire ground.
Now, you go on to say in paragraph 18 that your first board meeting was on the 22nd of May 2012, and if you look to the next paragraph on the same page, paragraph 19, you say in the third line down there, by the time I became a board member, there were only a small number of actions left outstanding to complete. Now, outstanding actions there, are you referring to the 34 LFB pre-Lakanal inquest actions?
I am, yes.
Right. If we turn then to page 8 of your statement, you say at paragraphs 31 to 33, and I'm summarising them, under pre-inquest actions, there were a number in which you were involved, and summarising them, you were involved in actions 4, 6 and 32. Yes?
Yes.
Yes. 4 was to complete a sequence of events or a timeline of the Lakanal House fire. Yes?
Yes.
6 was, as you say, it was to undertake a review of high-rise policy in order to improve guidance for staff and help them prepare for the demands of a similar incident. You don't say it in paragraph 32, you say it later on. Is that correct?
Yes.
But you don't, I think, suggest that you were involved in the substantive development of the policy, but the work, as you say in para 32, the work relating to the operational news articles would have come through my team and up to ODCB. That's as we've seen before, is it?
Yes, that's
this morning. And then action 32 at the foot of page 8, you say, I was not involved in the work surrounding this action, whilst the new policy was still in draft at the date of the Grenfell Tower fire, I should say. After the Fire Brigade's union had been consulted, I decided in the early hours of 14th June 2017 that the LFB's fire investigation team should use the policy to guide their initial actions in the immediate aftermath of the fire. I believe the improvements included in the policy greatly assisted the gathering of information and evidence to assist with the investigations that are still ongoing. Now, that's what you say there. So, turning against that background to the first of the things I want to ask you about, and that's the Lindridge review from January 2013. You cover this on page 6 of your statement. If we go back, please, at paragraph 20. And then the first line there, you say, the board minutes dated 7th September 2012 note that I provided an update that the audit of changes implemented across the brigade as a result of learning from Lakanal is underway. And you exhibit DC6. And then you say, I recall that this was a piece of work that was commissioned by the board to review the actions that had been identified by the board and to indicate whether they had been satisfactorily completed. It was work that was being carried out by a member of my team at the time, Group Manager David Lindridge. And then if you go to the bottom of the paragraph, you say that at the 17th of October 2012 meeting you provided a further update. Now, just pausing there, that was a matter of months, wasn't it, before the start of the Lakanal House inquest in January 2013?
Yes, it was.
Yes. Was the intention of the Lindridge review to ensure that the LFB was prepared for the upcoming inquest, or at least in the best position it could be in?
As I understand it, the review was to look at the 34 issues that London Fire Brigade had already internally identified, and to ensure that steps are being taken to meet those that would then subsequently feed into the inquest.
Yes, and put another way, to make sure the LFB was prepared for the inquest and in the best position it could be to tell the coroner what it had done already.
Yes.
Yes. Now, if you go to paragraph 21 of your statement on the same page, you say at the beginning there, my role in this work was to provide oversight as the Assistant Commissioner, but the detailed work was being done by GM Lindridge. What did your oversight involve?
So subsequently, having made the statement, I've then, as part of the preparation for coming to give evidence, I have been able to read through a lot more of my emails to understand how this piece of work came about. And Gary Reason identified GM Lindridge, who wasn't actually in my team at the time. I had forgotten that when I wrote this statement. He was seconded into my team to do this piece of work. He was working, I believe, in the training team at the time, and I think Gary must have known him. He identified him and asked him to come and do this piece of work. He was put into my team because I think we were able to use the skill set of the health and safety team, who were very familiar with conducting investigations, especially Dr. Adrian Bevan, so that we could provide GM Lindridge with the support that he might need to undertake this piece of work.
Right. If we go, please, to LFB 000833925, please. This is the statement to the inquiry of Group Manager David Lindridge. You can see that from the first page. It's dated the 18th of December 2019. And if we go to page 3, paragraph 12, he says this. I understood that the purpose of the report was to complete an audit of the actions taken to confirm what had been achieved. To achieve this, I determined that I would identify the state which existed prior to the Lacknell House fire and determine what changes had been made in the relevant areas subsequently. It was not intended to be a qualitative assessment, only a factual review of the actions which had been undertaken. Therefore, I reached no conclusions about whether actions taken were sufficient to meet the expectations of the board. I only described what steps had been taken so that the subject matter experts could make that assessment. Why was David Lindridge instructed only to undertake what he called a factual rather than a qualitative review?
I'm not entirely sure. I wasn't present at the meeting where Gary Reason asked David Lindridge to undertake the piece of work, so I'm not sure what or how the request was made or what the details were around that. And I was never made privy to that information, so I can't answer that, I'm sorry.
Right. Can I just show you what Gary Reason said about that, then, in light of that answer? This is the transcript, please, for day 180, page 116, at line 22. He says there that in answer to the very same question I've asked you, based on what Group Manager Lindridge has said in his statement at line 22 as the question, and his answer at line 25 is because some of the issues that he was going to review were outside of his sector competence, like control, he was not a trained control officer, so he would not have been able to make an informed judgment on the quality of things like training because he wouldn't have experienced the role of a control officer. So it was more just to assess whether the actions as defined in the Lacknell House pre-inquest action plan had been delivered, and it would have been for officers local to those management teams and functions for the qualitative aspect. Do you agree with that, so far as you can recall it?
From reading that, yes. I don't recall, I wasn't aware of the conversation at the time, but I would agree with Gary Reason's summary there.
Right. So it wasn't, is this right? It wasn't your decision to limit Lindridge's review only to a quantitative assessment?
I wasn't party to the conversation between Dave and Gary Reason about the aspects of that, so no, it wasn't my decision.
Right. Can I just show you a document? It's LFB 00109781. This is an email run from September 2012, and if you look at the email itself, it's from Graham Ellis to Richard Chandler, who had responsibility for, among other things, control at the time, and it's copied to you, David Lindridge and Adrian Bevan, subject Lacknell audit, 12th September 2012. Richard, as discussed earlier, operational assurance have been asked to lead on an audit of the actions as agreed by the Lacknell board. GM David Lindridge will be coordinating the audit process. David will be assisted by members of Ops Assurance, as well as other audit qualified staff if required. We have already agreed the scope of the audit with Gary Reason, AC Dany Cotton, and Adrian Bevan, Health and Safety. I understand that Gary Reason will be writing to all HOS to request their full support to the audit team. Now, just where he says, in the second paragraph there, that you were involved in agreeing the scope of the audit. Is that right?
Not that I recall. I think that it was more that we had agreed that Dave Lindridge would be reviewing all 34 actions right across different departments in London Fire Brigade, but I have no recollection of having any agreement on the scope of the audit and how it would be undertaken.
You may not have a recollection, but can you quarrel with the document which records your participation in the agreement of the scope of David Lindridge's audit?
I think that isn't a very clear statement of the scope of the audit. I mean, not necessarily the way the audit be undertaken or how that would be done. So I would be guessing to agree what I had seen, but I genuinely don't remember any conversation around whether Dave Lindridge would just be looking at the facts, but that would make sense bearing in mind that GM Lindridge was, as Gary Reason said, not a subject matter expert across a wide range of those 34 items, that he wouldn't be able to be a subject matter expert across all of those.
Right. I mean, did you or did you not participate in the agreement about the scope of Lindridge's audit?
I said I have no recollection of doing that, I'm sorry.
Right, you don't recall.
No.
Now, did you remember whether you or others, such as Gary Reason and Adrian Bevan, considered the possibility of instructing a range of different officers to undertake the review, who between them would have been competent to assess all of the pre-actions?
No, as I say, I was only aware that Dave Lindridge had been selected once he'd had a meeting with Gary Reason, and I was informed that Dave Lindridge would be the one to be conducting the audit.
Right. Did you yourself, to the best of your recollection, have any thoughts about, or ask yourself, how the LFB would be prepared properly for the imminent inquest if it didn't know whether all the actions undertaken thus far were any good?
I think that from what I understand from the Corporate Management Board, because they had been supplied with regular updates prior to me joining the board from the heads of the department and the relevant responsible officers discussing that the actions had been completed, that this was then an assessment across that piece. I think that probably that the Corporate Management Board at the time felt that they had trust in their responsible officers to updating the action plan, and that Dave Lindridge's purpose was to actually go and, because bear in mind the information he would be getting would be from those departments, so he would be, assessing that information. I was not aware of any conversations around having a wider team take part in that.
Did you yourself undertake any kind of qualitative assessment when you received Group Manager Lindridge's findings in January 2013?
No, I didn't.
Why is that?
Because the audit had been done in conjunction with a wide range of people who were qualified. I myself also was not qualified in a number of the areas that were being audited, so I wouldn't have the detailed subject matter expert. That would be dependent on the people relevant to those departments.
Wasn't it important to you to understand not only whether things had been done, but whether the LFB had truly embedded the lessons to be learnt from the Lacknell House fire?
I think that was the purpose of the Lacknell House Board. They were the ones who were assuring that piece of work right across London Fire Brigade. They were the ones who were receiving the reports, and all the heads of service of those departments were at that meeting, and those were the ones providing that assurance that the work had been done.
Yes, but do you not accept also that the remit of your own responsibility as ACOA at the time, operational assurance, was to assure those parts of the Lindridge review that fell within that remit?
So as operational assurance, as explained, my role was around the fireground assurance of the fireground situation, not around the detail of all those actions in that report.
Yes, but for example, incident command, which would fall within OA, wouldn't it?
That would, yes.
Yes, and was it not your job as a COA to ensure not only that the relevant actions in the 34 actions list that fell within your remit had been done, but that they had been done properly so that the lessons from Lacknell would be properly learnt and embedded?
For those areas of my department, yes, definitely.
You did. Did you do anything to make sure that what had been done actually met what it was that the Lacknell House Board was after?
So I was aware that, when I joined the board, the vast majority of those actions had been completed, and so it was picking up previous information from people who've been in charge of that. But I was assured that anything that operational assurance were responsible for had been completed by the members of the team who worked for me.
Yes, I mean, you told us you yourself undertook no qualitative assurance. My question really is why not, given that some parts of the Lindridge review fell within the scope of your supervisory role?
Because at the time, the work that was being done was ongoing. I could see the work because it was during my day-to-day work. I could see what was going on, so I don't think I felt the need to do that.
Let's look at the Lindridge review specifically. This is an LFB 000-33943. Now, there are a number of drafts of this document we've looked at with people's comments on them. I'm going to show you what I believe and I'm told is the final version or the latest version. But perhaps I think for this purpose it doesn't matter. If you look at the first page, you can see what it is, 4th January 2013. And if you go to page 4, paragraph 5.2, under the heading Key Findings, he says this: of the 34 actions, see Appendix 1, 16 have ongoing activities related to achieving the intended outcomes. These ongoing activities include those dependent on a future event which cannot be simulated, and those which involve influencing external agencies. These 16 also include those with an ongoing review of performance levels subsequent to the action being closed on the log. Now, just pausing there, following that finding, did you yourself take any steps to implement any form of tracking or monitoring system to ensure that those continuing activities were completed satisfactorily?
No, I didn't.
Why is that?
Because, and to be fair, without seeing the 16 and understanding what the detail are, then I believe that none of those were in the area of operational assurance, so that would have sat with the subject matter experts, responsible officers to understand that, because it was not something that sat within operational assurance.
Right, well, we may come back to that in a moment. Before we do, let's go on with what we see on the screen, paragraph 5.3. This review was unable to confirm 13 actions as fully achieving their expected outcome. For each of these, the actions are either ongoing or dependent on a future event. Now, again, as AC of Operational Assurance and as a member of both the Lacknell House Board and the ODCB, did you take any steps to look into those actions and ensure that they were ultimately completed?
I think this was raised at the Lacknell House Board, and that the Commissioner used the opportunity to question the heads of those departments about the ongoing actions. But they were subject to an ongoing report, so they were regularly reviewed. But that was not something that sort of sat in the operational assurance arena, as it were.
Right. At all events, you were not involved in any continuing monitoring?
No, I wasn't.
No. Looking at 5.4, a full list of the actions and a brief explanation of the findings is appended to this report. Listed below are the reviewer's key findings specific to 10 actions for the Commissioners Group's attention. And do you know why those particular actions were listed for the attention of the Commissioners Group?
No, I'm not sure. I've heard previous evidence where there was a conversation about why that said Commissioners Group. I'm not sure that, to be honest with you, this report would have gone to both the Lacknell House Board and probably to CMB. So I'm not sure why the Commissioners Group is referenced there.
Right. Right. And if you look at, for example, page 8, say, for example, if you look at page 8 and look at the 34 actions and the action log feedback there, you'll see that the number of actions and their references is listed on the left-hand side. The department is given there.
Yeah.
And the brief action title, reported action confirmed, activities ongoing and further review activity.
Yes.
Just looking at, for example, 22 and 24, those are about the bridgehead information recording and moving the bridgehead. So far as moving the bridgehead is concerned, in fact, both of those, there's a yes under activities ongoing. And you can see that they fall within the op department. Was that not for you to monitor?
No, that was operational policy.
Operational policy, certainly, but these are incident command or fireground operations matters, aren't they?
I think this was referring to the development and production of a policy in those two areas, which would have fallen for the operational policy department. That would then have been the subject of training, and then the intervention of operational assurance would have been monitoring the performance against that policy on the fireground.
Yes. Now, most of these actions, as you can see, related to the control room and FSG training. Do you remember whether you, Gary Reason or David Lindridge, had any concerns about the control room and how it had progressed its actions?
I don't recall. I myself did not. Gary Reason may well have had conversations with Dave Brown about those issues at the Commissioners' Board level.
Right. And in general terms, you can see what's flagged there. And the reason they're flagged, the fact is that there were some that were flagged for ongoing work, weren't there?
Yes, there were.
Right. Whether it was for the Commissioners' Group or another board, yes?
Yes, there were.
Yes. Now, we can see from LFB 30833988, if we go to that, please, that Group Manager Lindridge produced an updated version of this report in November 2013. And if you go to page 4 in that document, you come back to the similar section, Key Findings, and you see there's Key Findings, and then over the page, Conclusions. There's no longer an opening commentary that flags particular actions to the Commissioners' Group, as we saw in paragraph 5.4 of the January edition of this report. Do you know why that element was removed?
No, I don't.
I ask you because you know, maybe you don't, but confirm for me if you can, that by that time, November 2013, not all the actions had been fully addressed, had they?
Not from reading this report, no.
No. For example, FSG refresher training had suffered from a number of problems and wasn't being rolled out in accordance with the recommendations.
Yes, I understand.
Do you know whether Group Manager Lindridge was asked to update those items so that they no longer appeared outstanding or complete?
As I believe, I think from reading email correspondence in preparation for this, that Group Manager Lindridge met with AC Brown on a number of occasions between March and the subsequent updating of this in October, I think, and he received the updates from AC Brown around areas in relation to control. Right.
Do you know why Group Manager Lindridge's November 2013 report does not update those items, or rather, doesn't show them as still outstanding or complete?
He would have been working on the information supplied to him by AC Brown.
Right. Did you get any sense that the idea was somehow to sanitise the report's findings before it was presented to the Lacknell House Board or the Lacknell House Working Group as it later became?
No.
Now, Gary Reason gave evidence that the Lacknell House Board never formally received the Lindridge report. That's what he told us at day 180, page 130, lines 14 to 18. There's no need to turn that up. But do you have any recollection about why that was?
No, I don't. It wasn't until I did my preparation for this that I saw how many sort of iterations it had been through, and then I believe it was ultimately presented to a Commissioners' Group. But I think the issue may have been that the Lacknell House Board wasn't sitting during that period because the inquest had started.
Well, the Lacknell House Board, the inquest ran from January to March 2013, and the Lacknell House Working Group was established in the spring of 2013, about May time.
Yes, the Lacknell House Working Group was the elected members group.
Yes.
That was obviously separate for this, and that was in response directly to the coroner's recommendations. This obviously was the reports relating to the internal investigation that London Fire Brigade had taken, that the Lacknell House Board had sat with, and I think the Lacknell House Board, as I understand it, and as I remember, stopped sitting at the point when the Lacknell House inquest started, and then subsequently the Lacknell House Working Group was established to address the recommendations from the coroner.
Just help me with this. The Lindridge review took place between September and December 2012.
Yes, that's correct.
Resulting in the report in its first draft, or first edition, on the 4th of January 2013, a few days before the start of the inquest. Whose eyes was that document for, if not the Lacknell House Board?
It was for the Lacknell House Board.
Yeah. So why is the fact that the inquest was sitting, and was always going to be sitting for 3 months or so, representing the first quarter of 2013, any reason why it wasn't received by the Lacknell House Board?
I'm saying I'm not sure the Lacknell House Board met during that period. I don't recall, but I think the reason was that the board hadn't met.
Why would that make a difference? Why not circulate it to the members of the board so they could think about it?
But it was circulated to the members of the board, hence you've seen the several copies with different comments, was because the members of the board, that was shared with them. It was just that the final document was not then given to the Lacknell House Board.
Right. Let's go to the minute of the meeting of the Lacknell Board on the 30th of September 2013. Now, this is at LFB 000084048. Lacknell Board meeting 30th of September 2013. I think this overlaps. This is the period when the Lacknell House Board and the Lacknell House Working Group coexisted side by side.
Yes,
there was a period, and this help me if I'm with this was during that period.
Yes, I believe so.
Co-regnum, if you like, and you can see that you are a member of the board. You're identified as such as the last name on the list in paragraph 1. Yes.
I am, yes.
Yes, and if we go down to paragraph 5, actions arising from minutes, and you can see item 5.4. The post-incident audit report for outcomes of the Lacknell investigation has not been signed off by the board. Now, given that the board is meeting here in September 2013, why not? Why hadn't it not been signed off by the board?
I'm not sure, and I don't appear to have been in attendance at this meeting, so I don't recall why.
Right. Did you see the minutes at the time, even though you weren't in attendance?
I don't recall, but I imagine I would have been sent them as a board member. I would have hoped I would have been. Yes.
So it looks as if the Lacknell board did not receive as a board or sign off the January edition of the Lindridge review.
I suspect that as a result of this, this is why I imagine that this is why conversations were had and a subsequent edition was produced in October, because I suspect that realisation was had that they hadn't seen the audit report formally at the board, so they were asked. It was asked to be brought to the board, and therefore Dave Lindridge was asked to update that, and hence the then October edition of it.
Well, just look at what's just below what I'm showing you. Action in bold. TC, that's Tim Cutbill,
yep.
To arrange further meeting to discuss post-incident audit report. We know from other witnesses that meeting, the further meeting, did not happen. Are you able to tell us why not?
No, sorry.
Is it the case that the Lacknell board did not sign off on, or even receive and sign off on, either the January or the November 2013 Lindridge reports?
I'm not sure whether the Lacknell House board sat again after the September, whether there was a further meeting or not in which to receive it, but I know the report did then subsequently go to, I believe, the Commissioners' Group.
Right. Let me try it this way. Do you remember whether you, as a member of the Lacknell House board, ever signed off on either the January or the November 2013 editions of the Lindridge report?
No, I don't remember that.
No. Now, can we go please to Ron Dobson's first witness statement at LFB 000032157, page 10, paragraph 38. He says under action points as follows: as Commissioner, I had overall responsibility for ensuring the actions identified following the Lacknell House fire were implemented and in 2012 I instigated a review of the Lacanal Action Plan to date to be carried out by the Operational Assurance Division. That review was carried out by the Head of Operational Assurance, Dany Cotton, and Group Manager Dave Lindridge. This review is intended to confirm the actions that had been completed and to identify the actions that remained outstanding or where further work or resources were required. This review was reported to the Commissioners Group in January 2013. At this meeting, Head of Operational Assurance, Dany Cotton, was tasked to discuss the findings of the review with each Head of Service in relation to each of the actions in the action plan for which their department was responsible. Now, we know that the January 2013 meeting of the Commissioners Group did not go ahead, and we understand it from AC Reason's written evidence to the inquiry that the November 2013 updated Lindridge report was considered by the Commissioners Group at the end of that year, as I think you've hinted at. Can you summarise what was reported to the Commissioners Group when the Lindridge Review updated report was discussed in late 2013?
I can't recall the detail, but I know that the report that was going to be presented had been shared with all of the directors and the Commissioner prior to that meeting. They'd had sight of it, and then I believe that Dave Lindridge and I attended that meeting, and Dave Lindridge presented the findings that he had in his report, including the updates that he'd made subsequently in October.
So, even though your department wasn't necessarily involved in the outstanding actions as we've seen, is it right, as he says, that you were tasked to discuss the findings of the review with each Head of Service in relation to each of the actions in the action for which their department was responsible? Is that correct?
No, because the meeting he's referring to didn't happen, so I think potentially the Commissioner has maybe an incorrect recollection. It was a long time ago, but we didn't have that meeting in January 13, so he didn't task me with those things, no.
Very, very well. And in which case, was there a meeting, but at a different time in that year, or another
Only
year?
in November, when it was, or at the end of the year, when it was finally presented to the Commissioners Group as a complete report.
So, to be clear, your recollection is that you were tasked to discuss the findings of the review with each Head of Service, but only in the November of that year?
No, I wasn't tasked in November. In November, it was presented as the report was. There was no further conversation about reviewing it.
So, the last sentence of what I've read to you there from Ron Dobson is something you disagree with?
I do, yes.
I see. So you never, therefore, discussed the findings of the review with each Head of Service?
No, I didn't.
Did anybody?
Not to the best of my knowledge.
Right. Do you know why, to the best of your knowledge, nobody did?
No.
Right. Did you and Gary Reason ever have a discussion about why that had never happened?
No, I believe that Gary Reason, well, I know Gary Reason was talking regularly to the other directors about aspects of the report, and that he was speaking to Dave Lindridge, but that's as much as I know.
Gary Reason also told us that the Lindridge review was never, in either report, was never taken to, or even provided, in fact, to the Lacanal House Working Group. Do you agree?
I don't believe it was.
Do you know why that was the case?
No, I have no idea. That would have been a decision taken by the Corporate Management Board at the time.
You say that would have been a decision taken by the Corporate Management Board at the time. So let's see. At the time, that would have been the Commissioner, Ron Dobson, Risa Dexter, yes?
Yes.
Gary Reason,
Yes.
yes, and
Sue Budden.
and that's it.
There were other members, the Head for Strategy and Performance and the Head for Information Management sat on the board at that time, as did James Dalgleish as the Head of HR.
Yes, not you, though.
No, not me.
No. No. I mean, is it right, just looking at all the evidence, so far as you recall it, that beyond Group Manager Lindridge's collection of data from the various heads of service, there was never any scrutiny or qualitative evaluation of the work undertaken, the 34 actions undertaken, for example, to ensure that they had the desired effect?
Not as I'm aware, no.
Why is that?
I'm not sure.
That was something of a missed opportunity, would you accept?
Yeah, I would think so. I think that's, and Whether they had a conversation at the CMB or the Commissioners Group about that, I wouldn't have been aware, but I would say that was a missed opportunity.
Can I then turn to your role in the Lakanal Rule 43 monitoring, which took place after the inquest and indeed the Rule 43 recommendations? We've already touched on this, Ms Cotton, but the Lakanal House inquest ran from January to March 2013, and during that period you were still Assistant Commissioner for Operational Assurance.
I was, yes.
Yes. And at the end of the Lakanal inquest hearings, the coroner sent the LFB and others what was known as a Rule 43 letter, which contained her recommendations arising from the evidence, yes?
Yes, you did.
And we can look at that. It's LFB 000-32158. There it is, 28th of March 2013, addressed to Ron Dobson, and the title is Lakanal House Fire, 3rd July 2009. And in the last paragraph on page 1, she says this: before I set out my recommendations, I acknowledge that London Fire Brigade have already undertaken extensive work to learn from their experience with the fire at Lakanal House, have introduced new policies and have reviewed existing policies in respect of a number of matters of significance, including, and then she sets out a list. If you turn the page to page 2, you can see it there, a list of 10 bullet points, including, as you can see from the third one down, 72D visits, she calls them, awareness of fire spread, communication between control and the incident ground, and also the handling of FSG calls. Those are some of the 10. And she then goes on to set out her 5 recommendations, which we can see from the headers in italics. You can see them if you scroll a bit lower down the page. Public awareness of fire safety, visits made pursuant to 72D, and then continuing incident commanders, and then continuing over the page to page 3, brigade control, communications, and then before finishing with the heading response at the bottom, and that stipulated the time frame in which she wanted the LFB to respond to her letter. Now, I've shown you that. Now, we'll look in detail at the coroner's recommendations a bit later in your evidence, but just for the moment, I just want to look at paragraph 24 of your statement, please, page 7, your first statement. You say there, under the heading post the Lakanal House inquests, following the conclusion of the Lakanal House inquest on 28th of March 2013, the coroner issued recommendations under Rule 43 of the Coroner's Rules 1984 to the LFB and other bodies. The LFB then took the recommendations and identified a number of actions for the LFB to consider in relation to each. Can we take it from that it was the LFB's intention fully to carry into effect all of the Coroner's Rule 43 recommendations directed at it?
Yes.
Yes. We heard from Gary Reason when he gave evidence that he was instructed to establish an action plan to respond to these recommendations, and that he did so from April 2013 by meeting the heads of service, including you as head of operational assurance. Do you agree?
Yes.
And that he instructed heads of service to draft individual action plans relevant to their department. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Yes. And he told us that ultimately those action plans were taken to the Commissioners Group and used to inform the drafting of the LFB's response to the Coroner's Rule 43 letter. Can you confirm that?
I believe so. I don't recall the detail, but I do believe that happened.
We'll come back in due time to your role in the drafting of the LFB's response to the Rule 43 recommendations. But just for the moment, if we go to page 9 of your statement, paragraph 34, you'll see you say there, as explained above, my team was responsible for tracking the progress of the actions arising out of the Rule 43 action plan, but I do not believe any of the actions were allocated to me. Now, on the question of tracking, we could pick that up a little earlier in your statement at page 7, at paragraph 25. You say there, at a meeting of the ODCB dated 3rd of June 2013, an action was assigned to me to take the actions that had been identified from the coroner's recommendations and to produce an action plan so that progress against the plan could be considered at each meeting of the ODCB. And you go on. At the time, the LFB was already considering Rule 43 recommendations made by the coroner following the deaths of 2 firefighters in a fire at Shirley Towers, Hampshire, And so the action plan for those Rule 43 recommendations was also discussed at that meeting. The first version of the Lakanal House Rule 43 action plan was circulated and discussed at an ODCB meeting on 4th July 2013. And you exhibit it. You've referred to two exhibits in that paragraph, DC 10 and DC 11. Let's look at DC 10. That's at LFB 000-32730. And you can see that this is a minute of the ODCB meeting on the 3rd of June 2013. We can see one third of the way down the list of names that you were present as AC of OA, yes?
Yes.
And if we go to page 4, in the middle of the page, we can see item 7, Coroner's Rule 43 letters. And the text says this: the letters for Lakanal House and Shirley Towers were considered. It was agreed that ACOA would develop an action plan for the Lakanal letter. The Lakanal and Shirley Towers action plans will then be combined into one document, following the format of the SAI Action Plan Monitoring Report. A first draft of the action plans will be considered at the next ODCB meeting, and therefore they will be reported at the same time as the SAI Action Plan Monitoring Report. And we can see that you are the person to whom the action is allocated, yes?
Yes.
Why were you assigned the responsibility for developing the action plan?
Because within the Health and Safety Department, we already had what's described there as the SAI Action Plan, which was where we had any significant and major events in London Fire Brigade that were investigated, and an action plan would then be devised to address the issues raised. So those were normally issues of significant firefighter injury or significant failure of operational equipment. And I believe that Gary Reason and the Commissioner decided that the format that was used for that would be a useful format to follow for considering the recommendations from the Rule 43. Additionally, we were already considering the Rule 43 for Shirley Towers as part of that reporting process, so it meant that it would sit in the same reporting format, which was already familiar with ODCB, and that it would be monitored in the same way.
What was your role in relation to considering the lessons to be learned from the Shirley Towers fire?
So it was the role of operational assurance to take those actions and then to format them into a table, and then individual subject matter expert heads of department would be allocated tasks. So one of the recommendations was the risk of entanglement from falling cables, because the firefighters had tragically become entangled. So that was then given to the operational policy department to ensure that we had a policy around cable entanglement and subsequent training that came from that. So it would be to identify the recommendations in Rule 43 letters made to other fire and rescue services, and to translate those into seeing how London Fire Brigade performed against them.
Was that a common practice at the time?
Yes, it was.
So you did go about identifying fires from which lessons could be learned, even though they were outside London?
Yes, where Rule 43 recommendations were made, because the coroner would send the Rule 43 recommendations to every fire and rescue service.
But is it only where Rule 43 recommendations were made?
Yes, that's right.
I see. Rita Dexter told us that when you became ACOA, she asked you to do a piece of work to consider whether the ODCB was having regard to the best available range of information, or whether there were more things that could be taken into account. Do you remember being asked to do that piece of work?
Yes, that was I referred to earlier when the Deputy Commissioner said to me, I don't know what I don't know, and where else could we find information from? It was a very broad sweeping kind of statement that she just wanted to make sure that she was appraised of as much information operationally as possible. There wasn't a specific remit for that, and that would include things like the Rule 43 or where we had identified anything, but that was mainly the function of CFO to bring those to our attention.
Right. So that wasn't Lakanal specific?
No, not at all.
No, and I think you told us earlier you didn't actually in the end produce a written report.
No, we didn't.
No. Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient moment? We are mid-topic, but there's no useful landing
Probably
point.
no better place than, is there?
No, we're not near shore. So.
No. All right, thank you. Well, I think we should stop at that point then. Ms. Cotton, we're going to break now so we can all have some lunch. We'll resume, please, at 2 o'clock. And again, please don't discuss your evidence or anything to do with it with anyone else over the break.
Thank you, sir.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you very much. 2 o'clock then, please.